Hey there. Tonight we're diving into a day in the life of a one-room schoolhouse teacher and why it sucked. What you're about to discover is that before the bell you lit the stove, taught 8 grades at once, and sometimes got paid in potatoes. If these stories help you unwind, I'd love a quick like or subscribe, but only if they're genuinely working for you. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from. So drop your location and local time in the comments. It's amazing seeing our little community span the globe through these historical tales. Now settle in, maybe turn on some white noise, or grab your favorite blanket and let's drift into tonight's story together. You wake up before sunrise to a job that pays less than a skilled farmhand and comes with a morality clause that audits your soul. The window is frost-latticed, your breath looks like bad steam engine cosplay, and there's no coffee machine humming in the corner. You work in a one-room schoolhouse in the era when people believed you could run an entire K8 system out of a single box stove and a pile of slates. The country has somewhere between 190,000 and 200,000 of these schools in the early 1900s. According to the U.S. Commissioner of Education reports. That is not a charming postcard statistic. That is your reality at scale. You step out into air that bites like it has a grudge. 2 to 3 miles to the schoolhouse is a normal commute on foot. Planners in the 1890s loved a neat grid of districts, so no child would walk more than 2 miles, a theory anyone with a January face would happily debate. If it's winter, older boys show up this season because the farm no longer needs them. In summer, they vanish like snow off a tin roof. Attendance moves with the moon and the harvest, and you keep track of every flicker in an official register the county superintendent will look at later, with the serenity of a man not teaching 7 grade levels at once. You arrive at the schoolhouse, carrying the keys, the kindling, and 4 separate job titles: teacher, janitor, nurse, and fire steward. A rural school manual from 1910 by H. Fart says flatly that you are expected to handle housekeeping as part of instruction. Translation: you are hitting that cold iron stove with more precision than a machinist. Box stove or potbelly. Same rule applies. Nothing teaches fuel economy like 20 shivering children and a drafty clapboard box. The school board minutes might even say you are to see that the wood is split, and they mean you, not some invisible grounds crew. You pump water from the well and lug it inside. 1 bucket, 1 dipper, 0 germ theory in practice. Despite the fact that the United States has been publishing public health bulletins for decades, diphtheria and scarlet fever exist in the county doctor's ledger, and still the dipper goes person to person. By 1906, New York City is doing medical inspections in schools. Rural schools, not so much. Your medical kit is a rag, a bottle of iodine, and a steely look. Inside, there is a smell you will remember more vividly than birthdays. Coal smoke plus wet wool, plus ink, plus whatever a decades-old pine floor has to say on a damp morning. The blackboard runs along one wall, maybe slate if your district spent well, maybe painted pine if they didn't. Chalk dust powders everything, like the worst beauty trend of 1903. And you are the only person here who will sweep it up after class. Dustless chalk starts showing up in catalogues around 1904, but the budget often votes no. You fill inkwells. If it's below freezing, the ink sits like an icy bruise. Students keep bottles near the stove, and scorched notebooks result. Steel nibs replaced quills years back, and they are cheap enough that a county board might grudgingly approve a box. You still end up sharpening pencils with a penknife, because it's 1905 and electricity is for cities and world's fairs. not for you. Your light is a window with tall sashes deliberately placed for maximum north light. Because builders read a pamphlet from a state superintendent once and keep quoting it to justify not fixing the warped sill. The bell rope is in your hand. It is you who rings this little world into order. A bell the neighbors hear across fields, because that sound is the line between home labor and school labor. Students range from 6-year-olds just learning to sit upright at a desk without swinging their feet to 17-year-olds with hands like carpenters, some of them taller than you. This age span is why rural schools once hired male teachers in the winter term specifically, a 19th century trend that stuck like a stubborn rumor, even as women became the vast majority of teachers. By 1900, roughly 3/4 of US teachers are women. By the 1920s, it is about 4/5. In a one-room school, authority is not something you put on with a jacket. It is something you remint every morning under 30 to 40 pairs of eyes. Pay is not the compensation you imagined. Rural salaries around 1900 land somewhere between $30 and $45 a month for women and $45 to $60 for men. According to annual reports of the U.S. Commissioner of Education and State Superintendent's tables, the term lasts maybe 5 to 7 months. Arithmetic translates that into a yearly income skimmed down by winter board, laundry, and the degree to which your boots wear out. Urban teachers are clocking longer terms and higher pay. They also have janitors, a revolutionary idea. Someone brings a stick of wood because certain districts still expect pupils to supply fuel. If you want to understand labor exploitation with a Norman Rockwell color palette, look no further than a 10-year-old lugging a split log to school as a civic donation. Country Life Commission reports from 1909 complain about the state of rural schools in paragraphs that sound polite and read like a roast. The subtext covers poor buildings, short terms, scattered oversight, and your daily grind. Opening exercise begins. You stand at the front by the teacher's desk, a piece of furniture that is usually the only thing on a platform, symbolic elevation above the foot traffic. Some states still permit or encourage a Bible reading. Many schools open with a song like America, written in 1831, because singing keeps breath warm and discipline smoother. After 1892, the Pledge of Allegiance shows up in morning routines because Francis Bellamy wrote it for a national school celebration, and patriotic rituals catch on fast. You lead without a microphone, without a sound system, just lungs, dignity, and a clock that runs your life. Your attendance register is meticulous. You write names in ink that sometimes blobs, and you do not cross lines because some county superintendents mark teachers down for sloppy daybooks, like it is a moral failing. The subjects line up like an old-fashioned parade. Reading, spelling, arithmetic, geography, grammar, history, writing, and the legally required physiology and hygiene with special emphasis on the effects of alcohol and narcotics. That last part comes courtesy of the Women's Christian Temperance Union's decades-long campaign for scientific temperance instruction, adopted in every state by 1901. You do not skip it if you want to keep your certificate. The county exam you took covered orthography and penmanship, mental and written arithmetic, geography, U.S. history, grammar, and physiology. Many counties require a 70 or 75% average, with no grade below 60. That number determines whether you stand here at all. Today is a blizzard of recitations. W. Farts 1910. Manual notes. A one-room teacher may direct 35 to 40 short recitations daily. That number sounds impossible until you live it. Groups rotate to the front on a recitation bench, while the rest do seat work. 3 to 5 minutes per group if you want everyone to get a turn. First readers pad forward to sound out cat and man. Third readers bring MacGuffies with selections on moral courage and obscure 19th century poets. Seventh graders parse complex sentences as if diagramming grammar can hold a whole republic together. Eighth graders drill long division and compound interest problems straight out of Ray's arithmetic with step-by-step precision that, in theory, turns farm kids into bank clerks. You pivot so fast your brain does not file the movement as motion. Seat work is slates and copybooks. Slates because paper costs money and erases quietly. Copybooks because penmanship is a serious business. Spencerian script curves sweep across a page with the promise that neat writing equals good character. The ink nib catches. A left-handed child contorts under the pressure to write right-handed because the culture thinks the left is unseemly. There is no occupational therapist in 1907 rural Nebraska. There is you, an eraser, and a will to keep the line moving. You police fairness with things like the water dipper and the chalk. Influenza before 1918 is not trending in the newspapers, but you still watch for coughs that sound too raw. Measles shows up every few years. Diphtheria kills quickly if it arrives. You know farmers who have nailed yellow quarantine boards to their front gates. People still remember the January 12th, 1888 blizzard on the northern plains that killed more than 200 people. Many of them school children caught in a wild temperature drop while trying to get home. That story lives in your skull like a weather oracle. On a grey morning you sometimes look at the sky and calculate the distance between school and the nearest house. Discipline is legally on your shoulders. Courts in the 19th and early 20th centuries generally back reasonable corporal punishment, not state-sanctioned cruelty, but not gentle suggestions either. The ferrule, the flat paddle used by earlier generations, still appears in some places. The strap and the switch are more common by the turn of the century. The famous dunce cap appears in illustrations and certain urban schools, but the idea that every one-room school used it automatically is a myth polished by cartoons and nostalgia prints. What you really rely on is the social furnace of the room, the cold mallets of silence and standing time, the threat of sending someone home, and the knowledge that older boys could, if they wished, throw the furniture. That last part used to be why winter terms hired men. By 1900, the majority of winter teachers are women, and they hold order without a cavalry. The American Journal of Education prints both praise and warnings about maintaining authority in mixed-age classes that read like advice for lion tamers. You glance at the wall clock. It runs by wind. The tick fills a space between noises, like a metronome for nerves. Recitations roll. In geography, there is a wall map of the United States with Alaska and Hawaii, not yet states, colored in ways that make the plains look like an artist's pastel. You drill on rivers in order. Mississippi, Missouri, Ohio, Arkansas, red. You practice capitals. Springfield, not Chicago. Albany, not New York City. In history, the revolution shows up with dates that are supposed to imply destiny. In civics, you explain county court and town meetings, trying to get 12-year-olds to understand taxes without lighting a family feud. Your text situation is Darwinian. Standardization crept in late. Some districts finally adopt state uniform textbooks by the 1890s. Others run on hand-me-down chaos. MacGuffey readers in multiple editions. Ray's arithmetic in one bench. Wentworth's in another. Webster's blue-backed speller shows up in grandparents' trunks. The lack of uniformity is a detail historians wave like a red flag in reports, But for you, it means juggling content, like a street vendor juggling knives. You flip from one edition to another mid-lesson, improvising. The kids never notice because nothing about this place claims to be modern except your sheer will. Noon creeps up. You release for lunch. That means benches scrape back and pails come out. Tin lunch pails, or baskets hold bread, hard-boiled eggs, cold potatoes, maybe an apple, maybe some sausage, if a family is fortunate and generous. The phrase apple for the teacher grew from real customs where produce sometimes went to support a teacher's board, or as a thank you. In the United States, the modern pop culture version blossoms in the early 20th century, seeds scattered by songs and print. But the underlying habit is older and practical. Food equals goodwill. You are not paid in apples. But some years that line feels like a near miss. Outside, recess is a social map. Boys dominate one side of the yard with bat and ball, if anyone has managed an unbroken bat and a ball with some leather left. Girls take the other side with jump ropes or quiet conversation. The outhouses squat back by the fence. 2 of them, no plumbing, often no lock. Sanitation advice in state bulletins begs facilities with proper screens and careful maintenance. In practice, wind, spiders, and embarrassment are the routine. In winter, you push back against snowball wars because the medical consequences of a well-packed ice ball are not theoretical. Institute instructors mention eye injuries. You remind the crowd that no one wants to write in a sling. The older ones smirk, but the point stays. Meanwhile, you eat while cutting extra kindling. If the fire goes cold in January, the day drifts toward uninhabitable. In the 1910s, teacher journals still print advice on how to ventilate a schoolhouse without freezing everyone. An art that involves opening upper sashes and trusting that warm air rises. Like the pamphlet said, the stew of coal dust and chalk is still a thing by 3 p.m., and lungs exist. Medical researchers at the time do not have terms like particulate matter, PM2, 5 in daily use, but their instincts are not wrong when they advise fresh air and sunlight. Rural school architecture slowly tries to catch up with larger windows and better placement after 1900. Many schoolhouses ignore the suggestions because budgets always have a louder voice than advice. Afternoon means arithmetic grinds, grammar, diagrams, and penmanship practice. A state course of study might be pinned inside your desk, printed by a state superintendent's office as a kind of master list. You chase it like a train schedule that keeps moving, just out of reach. 7th grade arithmetic includes percent problems that walk right into adult banking. Compound interest gets 3 lines in the book and 3 hours in class across 2 months. You do actual financial math in a world where nobody will hand you a teaching pension for another half-century. A county superintendent might drop in, a kind of educational auditor, with a notebook. He inspects your register and tactfully checks for dust on the windowsills. Because cleanliness is a teaching virtue in this era, he listens to a recitation or 2. He wants to hear pronunciation drilled to standard and arithmetic steps laid out like a marching band. He may ask to see the effect of instruction on penmanship, that show pony of the era. He leaves with a nod. The nod decides whether you get a contract renewal or a recommendation for a slightly better post next term. Your profession runs on social proof. The myth poster, rules for teachers, 1,872 inches floats in the culture like a meme. The one that commands you not to marry, not to loiter in ice cream parlors, and not to dye your hair. Historians who love documents will point out that those posters are often 20th century recreations, meant for displays, not actual county directives. The reality lands nearby anyway. marriage bars exist. Many school boards in the late 1800s and early 1900s will not hire married women. Women who marry while teaching often leave by requirement or social force. You keep your job by being exemplary and single. You are expected to attend church, avoid public places that look frivolous, and present yourself as the moral custodian of the township. Diaries from teachers and board minutes tell that story without the graphic design. The contract eyes your time like a cat watching a string. Some districts pay you at the end of the month, some at term's end. Some will dock for tardiness and for closing early due to weather, even if they did not shovel the road. Contracts in rural Wisconsin, Iowa, Kansas, and New York often include cleaning. Some specify that you will supply kindling. Your benefits include the occasional cord of wood, laid by a trustee, a community social at which you MC the spelling bee, and the good opinion of the county paper. Spelling bees last into the 20th century as community entertainment. In a one-room district, the bee can double as mild political theatre, which families' children spell to the last rounds, tells the township who is thriving. Curriculum rotation keeps spinning. Younger pupils write their letters on slates you inspect in quick glances as you pass the aisles. Older pupils recite from memory, a passage in a reader so antique a modern museum would put it behind glass. The McGuffey readers first appear in 1836. By 1900, millions of copies have cycled through American hands. Selections from the fourth and fifth readers preach courage, thrift, duty, and the occasional poem about ancient Greece. You hear Marco Bozzaris so many times you could recite it in your sleep. Children learn to stand and declaim, a skill that once greased the wheels of a democratic culture that expects citizens to speak in meetings and on juries. That cultural logic is why Friday afternoon speaking pieces exist. They are not mere ornaments. They are prototypes for public life. A language layer complicates the room in regions with immigrant families. German, Norwegian, Swedish, Czech, Polish show up in households across the upper Midwest and Great Plains. Before World War I, many communities teach bilingual or alternate language classes informally for the younger grades. After 1917, English-only sentiments and laws grow louder in a rush of wartime nationalism. By 1923, the Supreme Court will slap down extreme English-only instruction, bans and a case about teaching German in parochial schools. You live in the in-between where a second grader shows up with minimal English, a perfectly intelligent person trying to figure out what geography wants from them. You teach in gestures and patient repetitions. You think about the county normal school. Teacher training is a moving target in this era. By 1900, fewer than half of rural teachers have formal normal school training beyond a short-term institute. Many hold only a county certificate earned by passing an exam and attending a week-long teacher institute. That institute covers methods, management, and moral uplift. Manuals like White School Management from the 1890s preach orderly routines and the gospel of the recitation. Progressive educators in cities are starting to talk about child-centered methods. Rural districts mostly watch, interested but broke. Mid-afternoon is when chaos ambitions rise. The littlest ones get napsy. The oldest ones grind their teeth at a long sentence that will not pass. You oversee 8 or more groups. Keep one eye on the firebox, one on the inkwells, and a third eye you swear you grow each term to monitor the back row. The back row is the zone where a 17-year-old's dignity can turn to rebellion if the teacher missteps. Stories in teacher journals from 1880 to 1910 mention rare but real scuffles, sometimes requiring local fathers to come in. Courts back teachers on reasonable force. but do not pay for convalescence. You pick your battles with a strategist's cold math. The janitorial part of your job gets another encore when someone spills ink. That violet-black spreads like a crime scene. You blot with blotting paper and chalk dust, a trick you learned at a county institute. It does not really save the copybook, but it saves the desk finish somewhat. Many desks are old, hardwood-topped, with an inkwell hole and a lid that slams. Teachers since 1880 have been telling kids not to slam lids. The lid still slams. The lid is the Big Ben of chaos cues. The schoolhouse itself carries design quirks. Windows run tall along the east or south wall. The teacher's platform adds a 6-inch stage that will warp in humidity. A production-era cast-iron stove sits in the middle, its gleam dependent on whether you share space with a compulsive polisher. Cloakrooms on either side of the front door provide a place for coats and boots. Many houses sport a bell tower that looks good in photographs. Trustees maintain it if they feel strongly about noise and pride. The building is not insulated. In certain states, fire marshals and state superintendents by the 1910s publish alarmed commentary about exits, flammable finishes, and the stovepipe threading through a roof patch. Architecture as a hazard is a common theme in historical surveys. Afternoon closing nears. Your voice has done 7 different versions of authoritative. The last recitation edges toward the finish line, and you can feel the room grow restless. Like a team at the end of a long plough row, you assign homework lightly, because you know the math of day labor. A child milking before dawn, feeding animals, or helping with winter threshing will not pass Latin roots after supper. Your homework often looks like reading aloud to a sibling, practicing spelling at the table, or copying arithmetic problems to be solved in class. You are not lazy on homework. You are strategic. You balance the county course requirements with the economy of time the household runs on. Dismissal comes with a bell ring and a ritual. Children recite the day's final reminders. Older ones help carry in wood or dump ashes without being told, because this room is as much theirs as yours. Families measure your work by the condition of their children and the tone of the room. You supervise the outflow. One child ties a scarf so slow you can feel your later chores tapping their feet. Another squeezes 3 pencils into a pocket because pencils break, and that pocket is the bank. The room empties. Your day does not. You mark the register, add up totals, write absent notes in the columns that will one day tick up to a report for the county. Some states demand monthly reports with attendance averages and grade progress. Those numbers become budget arguments and bragging rights at township meeting. You sweep the floor with a broom that throws up clouds. Many teachers oil the floor occasionally with used oil to keep dust down. Practice state bulletins, advise carefully, and fire marshals dislike. You wipe the blackboard with a damp cloth. Chalk slurry coats your hands. It dries a white band across your knuckles that looks like badges. You straighten the map. You cap the ink. You clean desks where someone etched initials with a pin. You lay tomorrow's readers in neat stacks, which is either a calming ritual or an act of prayer. You double-check the stove and bank it safely. Fires left green up in the stove can take a building in the night. Rural newspapers occasionally carry those stories. There is no insurance line big enough to fill the gap a schoolhouse makes in a community when it burns. Then there is the evening, which you spend somewhere that is not home, because home this term is a rotating schedule of other people's spare rooms. Boarding around is an old New England custom that radiated west with settlement. In the 1840s, Massachusetts, reports already complain about how often teachers move. By the 1890s, and even into the 1910s in some districts, The practice persists. You live with a family a week or two, then move to another, repeating this across a term until you have spent time as a polite stranger in a half-dozen kitchens. Some places offer a stable boarding house. Your district does not. You are a guest with a mental scorecard of where the bedding is cleanest and where breakfast is hot. You share supper with people who watch what you eat and what you say. The job requires moral management outside school hours. You are expected at Sunday services. You are expected to be sober, neat, and uncomplaining. Some communities expect you to lead a literary society meeting or a choral practice. A surprising number of social activities run through the teacher. Work-life balance is not on the program. Marriage is a career exit for most women. A few districts employ married women quietly if the labor market is bad. Larger towns create explicit bans. The Chicago School Board banned married women from teaching in the early 20th century and only slowly softened. New York City ran similar policies for decades. Rural practice varies by local politics and need. Your salary still sits on paper. You might receive it once a month, in cash counted by the clerk at the township hall. You might wait until term end. You will absolutely portion it carefully because this money is not big and your expenses are steady. Normal school to advance your license costs, money. If you want a better certificate, a first grade or second grade instead of a third, you study evenings. You read White School Management, the McMurray brothers on method, Sarah Arnold on reading, and Fogged on rural management. None of them will show up to clean your blackboard. You plan tomorrow's rotation with a pencil and a will. First grade phonics warm-up, second grade word, families, third grade reading with a poem, fourth grade geography with a relief map, fifth grade history review on the Constitution's 3 branches, sixth grade arithmetic review on least common multiple, seventh grade analysis of complex sentences with heady enthusiasm, eighth grade practical applications of percent to real problems like crop deals and interest. You fit those into time slots of 5 to 15 minutes each, with passing time a soft hum of shuffling. You put handwriting in every day because the county inspector judges a school by its copies. You thread science in where you can. Agriculture shows up in state courses for rural schools after 1900. You talk soil and seed with kids who already know more than the textbook because they live the experiment. Your body lists to one side. From the long day, you keep going. You staple mental notes into a plan. The boy in the back who stumbled on a hard word but blazed through fractions. The child who needs a gentler nib because the current one chews the page. The girl who stares out the window when grammar starts. Add in the 2 children who came late because of chores, and the case of ink that will not arrive until the train unloads at the depot 12 miles away. You feel the absurdity and the nobility in the same breath. State and national reports in the 1990s and 1910s talk about consolidation as a grand fix. Better roads, bigger schools, motorized buses, specialized teachers. The Country Life Commission in 1909 suggests rural schools must modernize to save the countryside. You exist on the working end of the pre-modern system, holding a flame while the world designs a flashlight somewhere else. That does not make your day less worthy. It makes it a grind with historical significance. The myths keep trying to barnacle themselves to your reality. The dunce cap, the abusive tyrant teacher, the idea that everyone was illiterate until progressive crusaders saved them. The fantasy that rural children were uneducated until consolidated schools arrived. The numbers refuse neat stories. By 1910, rural literacy in the United States is high by global standards. Rural schools graduate 8th graders who pass stomper exams that would cause a modern adult to sweat. At the same time, Teacher turnover in rural districts is high. Short terms, low pay, and boarding around wear people out. Many rural schools do close early for harvest. Many older rural children miss months of school each year. Two realities stack together, and both are true. You wash your hands with harsh soap in a basin by lamplight. You go over your county certificate and count months until it expires. Many certificates last 1 year or 2. Renewal requires another exam or institute time. Some states add reading circle requirements. Lists of professional books teachers must read annually for credit. The reading circle choices printed in state bulletins sit neatly on your mental to-do list next to patch the bell rope and request new chalk. You laugh without humor. If grit were currency, your salary would be lavish. The cold sinks in deeper now that you've stopped moving. You think of other one-room teachers in other states, part of that 190,000 strong system around 1915. You think of the hidden injuries of chalk dust and bad stoves, the persistent coughs, the cramped handwriting under low light, the inkwell stains that follow a person for a week. You also think of the outrageous fact that when electricity arrives in town in the 1920s and 1930s, many rural districts will wire the schoolhouse last. Radios will be novel. Your voice will still be the loudest machine. You iron a blouse or brush a coat, because clothes are currency for credibility. A tear at the cuff reads as neglect to some board member who believes visual order is character. Teacher journals explain wardrobe expectations as if style guides can fix budgets. You perform order with every scene. You plan the next community program, because the school doubles as a civic hall. Literary society on Thursday night. Pieces read by older students. Maybe a recitation of Lincoln's 1863 proclamation. Maybe a temperance reading from a Wedge tract. Because the local ladies group asked politely, and persistence is their brand. Spelling match at the end to throw the fathers into friendly rivalry. That night is part morale, part politics. It will remind taxpayers that the school is alive. It will remind them to vote for a textbook levy. You are a teacher and a publicist in an age before publicists. Your bed that night might be a rope bed that sags, a straw tick that announces its presence, a frame that creaks with the song of 1,000 nights. The house you board in will be warm or not, depending on how many children the hostess has and where she puts the fire. You lie down, and every sound from the day plays back. The scrape of benches, the slap of a lid, the call of a name in attendance, the dry swipe of the eraser. Your throat tickles from chalk. Your hands smell faintly of coal and cheap soap. Your feet ache with maps of the room worn into them, like the floorboards remembered your steps. Your mind refuses sleep, because it is still running the grade 8 arithmetic again, then cutting over to grammar lesson 4, then back to the 6th grade boy who yanked a pigtail and will meet a policy talk in the morning. Discipline notes get written in the register with care, because courts and parents can look. You think one more time about the law. By 1918, compulsory schooling laws exist in all states, though enforcement in rural places is as real as the nearest truant officer's horse. You have an attendance list that proves diligence. You have more children than the law can find on a muddy road. In February, you remember why you took this job. You probably finished 8th grade around 15 or 16, studied for a county exam, and stepped into a role that multiplies your reach. Normal school training is a dream you work toward, not a baseline you met. Teaching offers income, social status, and a way to hold a place at the center of a community story. It also keeps you under surveillance. The board notices your hat. The minister notices your Sundays. The grocer notices what you buy. The children notice everything. Power and precarity share a chair at your desk. You grin in the dark at the thought of the famous teacher rules poster with its ice cream parlor prohibition. Historians note that many of those printed sets are 20th century inventions for displays, not archival finds from 1872. You acknowledge the Apocrypha while mentally folding in the lived expectations documented in actual board minutes and contracts. A real 1900s contract can ban late-night socializing without mentioning ice cream. It can terminate you from marriage without the poster's Victorian flourish. Reality carries fewer exclamation points and more consequences. You count the day's tally. One last time, 35 recitations conducted, 3 lunch scraps turned into micro-diplomacy, 1 inkwell catastrophe managed, 5 kindling sticks chopped, 2 older boys aimed toward work instead of rebellion, 1 pledge, 1 song, a pile of slates wiped, 10 miles in teach steps, another 2 in winter boots, 0 janitors, 0 nurse, 0 sick days in your contract, a room full of minds moved forward an inch each, and in a 1-room schoolhouse, an inch earned is a day's trophy. Then, of course, the salary math stands up in your brain like a particularly rude teenager. $36 a month for a 6-month term is $216 cash. Subtract board if not included. Subtract clothes because your job is an advertisement for civic virtue. Subtract institute enrollment fees and travel. Subtract pencils, slate cloths, and the extra lamp oil because reading by moonlight is not a skill you own. The Commissioner of Education's reports print averages that look decent from a desk in Washington and sting in a kitchen when it's time to count. The gender gap hums in the background. The district pays you less than a man would make in the same post. Articles in the National Education Association proceedings note this without fixing it. The clock across the room clicks into a long pause. You breathe, and it feels like it scrapes in your throat. Chalk lives there now. Coal smoke rides along. Teacher journals in 1913 mention teacher voice, a polite term for a recurring hoarseness. You sip water with the ashes of the day flavor because the stove is a presence in everything. Your host family has politely given you a small lamp to read by and a quilt stacked thick. Oil lamps and quilts are the rural teacher's version of a wellness plan. You think about the towns that start wiring schools in the 1920s, the consolidated districts that form in the 1910s and 1920s, with buses the color of sunshine and rooms grouped by grade. They come. You are not in one of them yet. You are tired, and you still love part of this work with an evangelist's glow. Education reformers have already begun writing about child development and activity-based learning. Maria Montessori opened her first Casa dei Bambini in 1900. Sate. John Dewey has been publishing since the 1890s. Their ideas trickle into teacher, institutes, and normal schools. Rural methods change more slowly. The day you just lived is a 19th century machine running into a 20th century horizon, with you as the belt keeping the gears from flying off. Consider the hazards others do not see. Carbon monoxide from a poorly vented stove can fell a room. A bucket of water waits by the door because state bulletins demand it for fire safety. Windows are jammed or difficult, and escape routes in a panic are not theoretical fusses. Fatal rural school fires happen and populate lines in reports that make your skin prickle. It is no comfort to read a 1912 bulletin urging districts to keep exits clear when your cloakroom is currently hosting half the room's boots and all the bulky coats. You learn the rituals that reduce risk. You also absorb the ridiculousness of the situation. Town gossip clicks. The teacher boarded last week where the blankets smelled like a barn. The teacher seen walking with the school trustee. The teacher who wore a dress too bright. Gossip is an occupational hazard. Men in rural cases are not immune from public gaze either, but the moral surveillance sits heavier on women. That surveillance constrains your ability to rest. You are always also a public exhibit. You steel your spine with a final look at tomorrow's work. Grammar diagrams with branches like skeletal trees. Geography recitation of states and capitals in a rhythm that marks generations. Arithmetic building a bridge to bookkeeping jobs in town. Physiology lesson listing nervous system parts, plus the required cautionary talk about alcohol. That content is not optional by state law when temperance instruction rides the statute books. You deliver it with a logic that makes sense and a style the community recognizes as sober and respectable. You are a professional in a world that has not yet decided what that word should pay. If your district has a small library shelf, you access it like a thirsty person at a pump. Traveling libraries in some states, by the 1910s, send boxes of books to rural schools for a term. Wisconsin's Free Library Commission rolled out traveling libraries in the 1890s. Other states copy the plan. Reading material can be a lifeline for your older students and your own brain. You fill out the request cards and wait for the mail carrier or a passing buggy with a crate. Your institute instructor preached the habit of reading widely. You comply with the fury of a caged mind. You adjust the shawl, blow out the lamp, and the night does what nights do. It puts a lid on the noise and turns your work into a procession of images. The slate clicks against the desk, a sound like a low chime. The stove breathes. The room holds the day's warmth, like a relic. Tomorrow, you repeat everything with tiny modifications you carry in your pocket, like coins. You hold a country's school system together with chalk, iron, patience, and a pay stub that looks like a dare. This is why it sucked to be a teacher in a one-room schoolhouse. Not because the work lacked purpose, because the job demanded you be a whole district in a single body. You taught 8 grades in 40 recitations, kept a fire alive, hauled water, scrubbed a room, nursed colds, mediated feuds, ran community events, passed state-mandated temperance lessons, tempered back talk with case law compliant discipline, and lived under a microscope. All of that for $30 to $45 a month if you were a woman around 1900, with a 5 to 7 month term, paid late if the clerk got caught in a snowdrift. The system was ubiquitous. The US had around 200,000 of these schools in the 1910s, and it ran because people like you were the gear nobody designed, just assumed. You sink towards sleep with one more detail tapping the inside of your skull. The older boys show up again tomorrow because the farm doesn't need them until spring. They bring adult strength and half-grown pride and the dignity of labor. You will teach them grammar with a tone that respects that dignity. You will teach the littlest ones their letters with a tenderness designed to survive chalk dust. You will ring the bell and a circle of human beings will form in a place with no plumbing and no janitors, and you will make civilization happen for 6 hours. Then you will sweep the floor alone. The surprise is not that many teachers left after a few terms. The surprise is how many stayed long enough to wire their methods into generations. The school consolidation movement will roll slowly across the map. By 1930, the number of one-teacher schools drops to around 148,000. By mid-century, the classic one-room is an endangered species in many states. Those statistics will become someone else's report. Your report is chalk under your fingernails and a wallet that still does not believe in prosperity. The work mattered. The working conditions did not care. You pull the quilt up and let the room dim to silence. Tomorrow is another performance without a curtain. You are the stage manager, the cast, the custodian, and the public relations team. The bell will ring. The door will open. The stove will growl. The ledger will wait. The myth of the quaint little schoolhouse will float in from the future like a postcard, and you will laugh because you know the real story involves frostbite, ink, and the relentless arithmetic of too much to do and not enough pay to do it on. For our next story, we explore the life of Nicolaus Copernicus, revolutionizing astronomy. Picture this: a cathedral canon in a chilly Baltic town carefully aligns wooden rulers on a homemade instrument, squints at the sun, and rearranges the universe. No telescope, no lab coat, not even a comfy observatory dome, just a walled stronghold, a few iron tools, and a brain that refused to keep Earth glued to the middle of everything. He was Nicolaus Copernicus, born the 19th of February 1473 in Turin, a Hanseatic red brick city on the Vistula River that had recently pledged allegiance to the Crown of Poland. Family business dealt in copper and trade routes, not comets and epicycles. His father, also named Nicolaus, died around 1483, leaving the boy in the orbit of a powerful uncle, Lucas Watson Rhode the Younger, who became Bishop of Warmia in 1489. That uncle, sharp as a merchant's ledger, would pull strings that let a nephew quietly move the heavens. Early Turin looked like a shoebox diorama of late medieval prosperity. Warehouses stacked with cloth, salt, and metal. Church bells timing out the day. Not exactly a nursery for astronomical rebellion. Yet by 1491, the teenager who would jostle the cosmos headed south to Krakow, to the university that had already sharpened minds on Euclid and Ptolemy. The Jagiellonian University was the right kind of messy. Mathematicians swapping manuscripts, lecturers scribbling planetary diagrams, Regiomontanus's tables passing hand to hand like contraband for the ultra-nerdy. Copernicus spent roughly 1491 to 1494 steeping in arithmetic, geometry, and astronomy. No diploma showed up, which was normal. Students often left once their minds were armed, and their patrons called. The patron called. By 1497, thanks to the bishop uncle's influence, he was appointed a canon at Fomborg Cathedral in Warmia. The position came with income and responsibilities, not necessarily with celibacy vows. He was not a monk. He was not a priest. He was a member of the cathedral chapter, part of the secular clergy in a self-governing corner of the Kingdom of Poland. Imagine a community of well-educated officials who balanced church property, legal disputes, taxes, and sometimes piles of grain and timber. Now add a man who kept looking up. Before settling into that Baltic routine, he left again. In 1496, he registered to study canon law at the University of Bologna, Europe's gold standard law school with a sideline in everything else a curious mind could want. He landed in the orbit of Domenico Maria Novara da Ferrara, an astronomer with a flair for challenging old models. Night skies over Bologna saw them both at work. On the 9th of March, 1497, they recorded an occultation of Aldebaran by the moon. It was a small data point, one luminous dot sliding behind a larger disk. But for a young scholar, it functioned like permission. Observations could rub against tradition and leave a mark. Italy inflated the mind and expanded the repertoire. He studied medicine at Padua, starting in 1501, because every bishop needed a reliable doctor, and Warmia needed one who could calculate bloodletting schedules without killing anyone. He picked up a doctorate in canon law at Ferrara on the 31st of May, 1503. He became the most dangerous thing in late medieval Europe, a competent generalist, lawyer, physician, humanist, astronomer, translator. A side quest in Krakow in 1509 produced a Latin translation of the Greek letters of Theophylact Simocata, printed by Jan Haller, because apparently running a cosmos also requires translating snarky Byzantine epistles. Then Warmia reclaimed him. He set up near Frombork around 1503, working first alongside his uncle in Lidzbark-Warminski, then from a tower above the lagoon, where Baltic winds finally learned what ambition looks like in wool robes. He built his own instruments, a trichetrum for angular measurements, quadrants, and armillary spheres. These were not toy props. Precise woodworking and careful sighting turned them into extensions of his mind. He gauged the sun's height. He timed equinoxes. He looked for patterns hidden under the nightly shuffle of planets. Around 1510 to 1514, he took the strongest thought he had and wrote it out in a clean little Latin draft. Not a treatise designed to crash European book markets. A small handwritten booklet, a beta release for colleagues. The Commentariolus, people call it the Little Commentary, laid out 7 axioms that flipped a millennium of geocentric comfort. Earth was not the universe's throne. The sun sat near the center. Earth rotated daily and orbited yearly. Retrograde planetary loops were a trick of perspective because Earth was also moving. It was a tidy conceptual earthquake, confined to a few pages and a few friends. The book never went to a printer. It was passed around like a shared whisper among those who knew the difference between clever and correct. His world never gave him empty years to write. Duties multiplied. Warmia's cathedral chapter needed governance, property management, court representation, and practical healthcare. He was the guy who could lance a boil, fix a land dispute, and then step outside to track Mars against a background constellation. And apparently even Pobs got Copernicus on their to-do list. During the Fifth Lateran Council, convened 1512 to 1517, under Pope Leo X, reforms of the calendar came up. Leap days drift. Easter's wander. Easter's wonder. The Church wanted to straighten the cosmic invoice. Copernicus was asked for input. He responded that calendar reform demanded better solar data and deeper astronomical understanding. Translation into normal speech. Call me when you stop pretending those old tables are precise enough. Meanwhile, Warmia turned into a martial borderland. From 1516, the canon selected Copernicus as administrator of church properties in Olsztyn. This was not a side office with a fountain pen. It came with a fortified castle, supply lines, and a front row seat to political friction. When the Polish-Teutonic War of 1519 to 1521 erupted, he managed defences at Olsztyn Castle. In January 1521, an expected assault forced him into strategy mode. He enforced resource controls, gathered men, and made sure the walls meant business. There is no scene with Copernicus, personally, jousting in the courtyard. What matters is that Olsztyn did not fall on his watch. He combined legal mind, logistics, and a tolerance for cold nights into a successful defense. Add it to the already improbable resume. Universe mover, treasurer, city defender. The castle housed another piece of the story, rediscovered by conservators in the 21st century. On a wall inside Olsztyn Castle, under layers of plaster, lines and numbers appeared. An instrument drawn across stone, likely used by Copernicus in 1517 to measure the equinox with sunlight cast through a hole. Picture him turning a piece of architecture into a solar observatory. The sun as a laser pointer, and the castle wall as a calibrated ruler. The man weaponized geometry with chalk and patience. After the war, he pivoted from gunpowder to money flow. Warmia and Royal Prussia were suffering coin chaos. Dazed currency sloshed through markets, eroding trust. At the Prussian estates meeting in 1522 at Grugions, he presented formulas for monetary reform, and by 1526 wrote a clear treatise, Monetae Cadende Ratio, on the minting of coin. He argued that unified, trustworthy coin was necessary for healthy trade, and that bad coinage drives good coinage out of circulation, an observation later famous as Gresham's law. He reached that conclusion before Thomas Gresham's birth year ended. In the land of astronomical revolutions, he quietly authored early modern economics from a desk stacked with coin samples and ephemerides. Through all these side quests, he kept refining the cosmos on paper. The sun's tilt relative to Earth's orbit came out near 23.5 degrees, an improvement on Ptolemy's older numbers. Distances between planets popped out as ratios rather than guesswork. Because once Earth becomes a planet, geometry lets you triangulate. He did not need a telescope to know that Mercury and Venus sit inside Earth's orbit, or that Mars swings outside. He figured the cosmic family photo order correctly. Mercury, Venus, Earth, and Moon. Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. That was the entire known solar system for 16th century Europe. A 6-planet lineup with the sun in the power seat. The myth that he spent his life living in terror of churchmen dissolves under the paperwork. He served as a church official, published humanist work, defended the bishop's castle, and dedicated his magnum opus to a pope. Suspicion existed, yes. Flashy new cosmologies trigger eyebrow lifts. But the idea that he lived in dread of a pyre misreads the 16th century. The fireworks would come later with telescopes and tribunals. His own years were a chessboard of consent, caution, and pragmatism. Pragmatism also covered domestic life. In the late 1530s, a lodging arrangement in Frombork raised eyebrows. A woman named Anna Schilling, likely a relative, served as his housekeeper. Letters from the area's bishop, Johannes Dantiscus, and other church officials demanded her removal, citing canonical strictures about appearances. The correspondence shifted from gentle reminders to stern commands. He resisted. He complied only by 1542, sending her away under pressure. Historians cannot pin down romance beneath the paperwork, and they will not invent it. What stands are letters that show a stubborn streak and an aging canon prickly about intrusions. Human. Complicated. Not a plaster saint with a telescope he did not own. By 1530, the manuscript that would become De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium, on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres, existed in some form, but it was marinating. Years of revision followed. A breakthrough accelerant arrived on a ship from the German lands in the summer of 1539. George Joachim Rheticus, a 25-year-old mathematician from Wittenberg, trained under Philip Melanchthon, arrived in Frombork like an excited postgraduate who had found the source code. He stayed for nearly 2 years. He studied the manuscript. He learned the methods. He soaked up the mathematics. Then he did what every modern influencer does for a friend's project. He launched a publicity campaign. In 1540, in Danzig, Rheticus published the Narratio Prima, the first account of Copernicus's theory. It read like a guided tour through a new universe, sprinkled with real data and a tone of barely contained euphoric calm. This was not a gossipy pamphlet. It was a mathematically literate argument telling Europe's educated elite that the sun sat like a king and Earth moved. The book found ears. In 1533, before the Nicolaus, Johann Widmanstatter had already given lectures in Rome, summarizing Copernicus's cosmos to Pope Clement V and others. In 1536, Cardinal Nicolaus von Schönberg, Archbishop of Capua, wrote a formal letter urging Copernicus to publish. These were not mobs with torches. They were high-ranking readers, tapping their pens on desks, wondering when the full work would drop. Rheticus, now playing manager, took the task further. He arranged a printer in Nuremberg, the respected Petraeus Press, renowned for high-quality scientific volumes. The manuscript travelled from the Baltic to the city of engravers and mathematicians, and typesetters started transferring a contrarian sky into movable type. Rheticus oversaw the beginning of the process, then left to accept a university appointment. In stepped another theologian with editorial access, Andreas Osiander. He added a short, unsigned note to the front of the book, suggesting that the whole system could be taken as a computational hypothesis rather than literal description. It was the cosmic equivalent of a liability waiver. Astronomers had long used models as calculating devices. Osiander wanted to keep the peace by framing Copernicus as adding another handy model rather than rewriting reality. The stray preface reshaped the book's early reception. Readers who wanted deniability found it. Readers who wanted gutsy truth glared at the page. Johannes Kepler would later identify Osiander's authorship and express the kind of exhausted fury known to every scientist whose strongest paragraph got hedged by someone else's footnote. As for Copernicus, evidence suggests he was ill and had no chance to approve or rebut the insertion. His friends suspected a corporate-style ambush. Tiedemann Gies, a bishop and his longtime ally, knew which hand wrote the hedging. The purity of heliocentric courage came wrapped in a layer of plausible deniability that he probably never requested. He never became a bookseller's presence. He died on the 24th of May, 1543, in Frombork, age 70. Traditional accounts say that a copy of the freshly printed book was finally placed in his hands and that he briefly saw the universe in print as he left it. Tradition makes gripping cinema. Documents cannot guarantee the scene. What exists is a tidy coincidence of dates and a body of work that outlived its author. Sources for his life are a web of letters, cathedral records, student registers, and the published works themselves. The careful detail work of historians. Consult the studies of Noel Swerdlow and Otto Neugebauer on astronomical models, Edward Rosen on biography, Owen Gindrich on the book's publishing history, Alexander Birken-Major on Polish contexts. Yields a man less mythic and far more amusing. He is the universe's least dramatic revolutionary on the surface, performing bureaucratic tasks by day and building a geometry of motion by night. The physics behind his math was not modern. He did not banish all epicycles. He loved circles too much to give them up, partly because uniform circular motion was the gold standard of ancient celestic aesthetics, and partly because the data still needed that fudge. De Revolutionibus still uses dozens of circles. Count them as Swerdlow and Neugebauer did, and the number rises to roughly 48 when all latitudinal devices are included. The genius lives elsewhere. He cut the knot of retrograde motion by moving the observer. The illusion of Mars looping backward becomes the parallax effect of Earth passing an outer planet on the inside lane. Mercury and Venus ducking toward and away from the Sun turn into inside track sprinters whose morning and evening appearances are built in. Conceptual economy mattered more than counting circles. His numbers were tidy. He set Earth's daily rotation on an axis tilted a little under 24 degrees relative to the plane of its orbit, within a hair of modern values. He kept the moon orbiting Earth, a stable companionship that saved the tides and the month. He produced relative distances for planetary orbits by using known synodic periods and his new arrangement, unlocking a cosmic map with actual scale rather than mythic speculation. Suddenly, Jupiter became a place you could slot on a ruler. He did not come out of nowhere. He built from a mature tradition that included Greek geometry and late medieval Islamic astronomy. The mathematical gadget known as the Tusi couple, devised by Nasir al-Din al-Tusi in the 13th century to create back and forth linear motion out of two circles, shows up in his models. The Urdi lemma, another geometric device from Mu'ayyad al-Din al-Udi's work at Maragha, and planetary arrangements resembling those of Ibn al-Shatir appear in his constructions. Europe was a fan of Greek texts, but quietly used Arabic and Persian mathematics whenever it sped the calculations. No romantic solitary genius can solve a problem at this scale without a supply line of ideas. He transformed the supply into a system. He worked in Latin, but lived among multiple languages. Warmier's chapter used German, Polish, and Latin. Torun housed a mix of German-speaking and Polish-speaking citizens, a Hanseatic city under the Polish crown since the Second Peace of Thorn in 1466. National labels, redrawn by later centuries, do their usual mischief on the 15th century reality. He wrote to Polish kings about money, administered lands for a Catholic chapter in Royal Prussia, and corresponded with German humanists. He was a citizen of a federated multilingual world where law and Latin mattered more than flags. Reactions to his cosmos were complicated rather than catastrophic. Some Lutheran scholars sniffed. Philip Melanchthon expressed concern, and anecdotes recorded by students of Martin Luther mention the reformer's skepticism as a dinner table aside in 1539. Yet, the Wittenberg Circle taught parts of the system as a useful computational tool. Catholic mathematicians discussed, adapted, and sometimes quietly adopted his calculations. The book's dedication to Pope Paul III was not a troll. It was a request for patronage and protection, wrapped in elaborate Renaissance flattery. Official condemnation came only decades later. In 1616, the Congregation of the Index suspended De Revolutionibus until corrected, adding asterisks and marginal notes to rein in a few statements until clearer proofs emerged. The work re-entered Churchly, good graces with modifications, and was removed from the Index entirely in 1758. The biggest institutional drama is the Galileo affair of 1633. A generation after telescopes turned Copernicus's neat geometry into powder for old arguments. One piece of the myth that does survive is his caution. He hesitated to publish for years, and for reasons not reducible to fear. He was exacting about mathematics. He needed better observations. He carried heavy administrative loads that pulled him away from tables and compasses. He also knew how the intellectual game was played. Bold ideas rolled out behind protective curtains in early modern Europe. He protected himself with dedications, with careful prose, and with polite deference. He played strategy like a castle defender, which he was. Patience served him. The daily rhythm of his Frombork years pairs beautifully with the shape of his denunciation of geocentrism. In the day, he sat with petitions, tabulated rents, recorded grain shipments, settled complaints, and kept the medical bag nearby. He rode out to inspect properties. He organized workers, sometimes plodding through snowdrifts along a misty lagoon border. At night, he climbed to his observation platform and measured the sky with his wooden tools. The cold salted his beard, and he shaded his eyes from torchlight to preserve night vision. Against long winters, he wielded tables and pencil. Some nights were lost to clouds, some were lost to obligations. Slowly, the data stitched together the cosmic choreography he already suspected. The mathematics inside his book read like Ptolemy, re-engineered by someone with a sense of humor about illusions. I built the philosophical case that Earth moves in three ways: rotation, revolution around the sun, and precession of the equinoxes. Book 2 treated spherical astronomy and the length of the year. Book 3 tackled the motions of the sun. Book 5 handled the moon. 4 and 5, or 5 and 6, depending on editions, delivered the planets. The last part read like the world's most elegant spreadsheet, stuffed with geometry and periodicities. It is not fast reading. It is precise, stubborn, and at times surprisingly poetic when he describes the sun enthroned, lighting all things, as if the center of power finally sits where the evidence has been pointing for 2,000 years. Spare a thought for the printing. De Revolutionibus Orbium. Coelestium opened with an ornate title page and marched forward with diagrams drawn to be understood by readers who, like him, kept compasses on their desks. Atreus's shop handled errors with errata sheets and author corrections, but the Osiander preface slipped through. The reader found an unsigned note instructing them to treat astronomical hypotheses as calculating engines, not necessarily literal descriptions. Then came the actual dedication letter to Pope Paul III, where Copernicus presented the stronger view. 2 voices at the front door. One hedged, one aimed at truth. Future readers who cared about which was which pored over copies and discovered telltale signs of who wrote what. Owen Gingerich's 20-year census of surviving editions tracked which pages were corrected and which margins annotated. An archival detective story proving how humanists spread and digested this thin, dangerous book. Margins bloomed with notes, underlinings, and small wars between readers and text. While the book travelled, the person who wrote it lay still in his crypt. His grave went unmarked sufficiently that centuries later, archaeologists would need DNA from relatives to confirm which old bones were his. In 2005 and 2008, forensic teams, Polish researchers, and cathedral authorities pieced evidence together from a skull found near the altar and a hair preserved in a book to suggest a match. The remains were ceremonially reburied in Frombork Cathedral in 2010 under a black granite slab etched with a sun orbit diagram. If the idea of a body finally joined to a symbol of its thoughts seems too on the nose, remember that early modern Europe loved cosmic puns even more than it loved gilded altarpieces. The intellectual aftershocks are easy to dramatize, but better to ground in actual consequences. Tycho Brahe, in the late 16th century, proposed a geo-heliocentric compromise. Planets orbit the sun, while the sun orbits a fixed Earth. Because Tycho's instruments were superb, and his appetite for paradox was healthy. Kepler, armed with Tycho's data and a willingness to abandon circles, produced ellipses and the 3 laws that made orbits calculable without the Baroque epicycle architecture. Galileo, in 1609 and after, tilted a small telescope toward the sky. He saw moons orbiting Jupiter, phases of Venus, and mountains on the moon. Physical details that lacerated Aristotelian purity. Newton, in 1687, wrote the Principia and gave force to motion and curvature to orbits, tying Copernicus's geometric recentering to the mechanics of the entire sky. Each depends on what the Frombork canon dared to write. The sun did not move planets, like a monarch nodding from a throne. Gravity did, but without moving Earth off the throne. Gravity would have had nowhere consistent to rule. He lacked other footprints worth pointing out, because they round out the person behind the theorem. The Olsztyn Equinox wall instruments showed a craftsman's sensibility and a hacker's impulse to use a castle as a measuring device. The monetary treatise proved he could do economic policy with the same clarity he brought to orbits. He probably diagnosed his uncle's ailments and managed bloodletting schedules with safer hands than the average barber surgeon. He carried out diplomatic missions for the Warmia chapter, shuttling messages to and from Polish kings, Prussian estates, and Teutonic officials with a voice that combined authority and caution. He navigated social networks with a modern appetite for influence without flamboyance. Friends included Tiedemann Gies, who housed him for periods and defended his ideas. Rheticus became his most visible amplifier, but others prepared the runway too. Widmanstetter in Rome, Schoenberg's letter, mathematicians from Krakow to Nuremberg, who smelled something fresh in the air. Even his critics contributed. Attention, you cannot build a lasting legend without friction in the comments section. Debunking the standard myths lands like sweeping confetti from a floor to see the actual pattern. He was not a monk and was not cloistered. He was a secular canon in Warmia, a political and economic manager who filed reports, attended chapter meetings, and argued about property lines. He likely received minor orders, but was not ordained a priest. He had household arrangements that annoyed superiors. He drank the same wines, ate the same fish stews, and wore the same wool as other officials on the Vistula and the Baltic. He was not punished by the Inquisition. He died peacefully. His book was dedicated to a pope and existed in print for 73 years before church authorities demanded modifications. He did not burn any heretics, and no tribunal tied his name to chains. The biggest immediate explosions around his work were in faculty rooms and printing houses. He did not eliminate epicycles, and did not make the heavens drastically simpler in terms of curve count. He chose a model that rendered the system simpler at the level of causes, fewer categories of celestial motion, a single center, clear scale. He paid for progress with a pile of circles inside circles, because circles were still the math that matched the data tolerably well until Kepler pried them apart. He did not do it alone. He borrowed, adapted, and absorbed. Greek geometry provided the skeleton. Islamic astronomy injected the muscular, ingenious devices that could mimic complicated arcs with simple combos. Renaissance humanism gave him libraries and correspondence. University training gave him mathematical habits that resisted bad approximations. He did not rush into print because he was not chasing book sales. He was solving a geometry of motion that had to color inside the data. He had civic work that mattered, patients to treat, mints to reform, forts to hold. The print timeline often reads, less like fear and more like a workaholic's calendar. Travel back into one of his observational nights to feel how he reached the conclusion. In Frombork, winter cuts hard by the lagoon. The cathedral tower gives the best horizon. He aligns his triquetrum, a wooden device with sliding arms and sighting vanes, to fix the position of Mars. He compares it to a star he trusts, reduces the measurement with tables, inked with care, and adds a dot to a graph of numbers. Repeat for weeks, for months, for years. He sees the same looping shapes and realizes that the loops go away if you let Earth move and watch from the right frame. The story becomes one of parallax. The sky stops pretending to be a crystalline sphere pinned with divine LEDs and turns into a clock governed by geometry. The change is both small and enormous. Small, because nobody's crops fail if they acknowledge that Earth moves. Enormous, because humans lose their architectural centrality and gain a place in a solar system, a neighborhood rather than a mansion. Lay out a few numbers for the record keepers and the curious. He lived 70 years. He took about 30 years from early drafting to full publication of his major work. He used at least 3 universities across 2 countries and at least 4 professional skill sets. He helped administer a territory of roughly 12,000 square kilometers in Warmia as part of the cathedral chapter's duties. He served in direct property management in Ulster from 1516 to 1521. With war in the middle and victory at the end, he wrote an economic treatise in 1526 that anticipated a principle named after a future English financier. He measured the obliquity of the ecliptic to within a few minutes of arc of modern value. He built a heliocentric table set that professionals would consult for decades, because once you put Earth in the right frame, numbers fall neatly into place like coins into a minting die. Even his name tells a story. He signed as Nicolaus Copernicus in Latin. In Polish records, Mikołaj Kopernik appears. In German contexts, Nicolaus Kopernik shows up. The root nods toward copper, which his merchant father traded. The copper man handed the universe a new alloy of Greek thought and Baltic grind. When looking for drama, early modern science often supplies quiet subversions rather than battles in town squares. The Osiander preface counts as a subtler dramatic twist than any courtroom exchange. It teaches that ideas sometimes reach the public wearing disguises. Copernicus's truths slipped onto the stage wearing the mask of a hypothesis. Mathematicians removed the mask in their classrooms and letters. The street cared little. Farmers sowed. Traders haggled. Sailors navigated by tables, only slightly different from last season's. Then, over decades, the center of the story moved. Kepler's ellipses knocked the epicycles down like bowling pins. Galileo's telescope gave Europe moons circling something other than Earth. Newton tied the whole thing to a single force that worked from apples to Saturn's curve. The geocentric world died not by decree, but by accumulation, a heap of details too convincing to ignore. That is the kind of revolution Copernicus delivered. Not a firework, but a tectonic shift. Fewer people notice when a continent moves than when a cannon fires, but both rewrite maps. Back in Ulster, that equinox wall is the most underrated relic. Imagine sunlight knifing through a small hole at a calculated time, lancing across a network of lines he drew and labelled, and striking exactly where the date demanded. It feels modern to turn big stone and small light into a measurement. It proves that do-it-yourself engineering sat right beside heady theory. He would have loved laser pointers. The Death House legend holds because it makes a neat ending. A book barely in time, a hand tracing letters he waited decades to see in print. Then, a quiet breath, a body still. Go easy on the legend. It is neat because it is tidy. The real ending is more satisfying. The book sailed out anyway, prefaced with a hedging note dedicated to a pope, laced with geometry, and thick with orbits no one had accepted in bulk for almost 2 millennia. The print shops folded sheets. Scholars unwrapped them. Margins grew busy. Dissenters barked. Calculators nodded, and the sky kept moving, indifferent and precise, waiting for someone else, with an instrument and a theory to adjust the numbers. By the time the Congregation of the Index issued its 1616 decree suspending the book until corrected, a generation of readers had already treated it as more than hypothesis. The 1620 list of corrections let it back into polite company with phrases softened, and in 1758 the ban lifted entirely. Meanwhile, schoolroom diagrams had migrated. A desk globe for Earth and a model for the solar system crowded out the old armillary with Earth at the center. The new default carved itself into wood and brass. That is how you know a revolution succeeded. Cabinet makers get involved. For anyone keeping a scorecard, he never saw a telescope. The instrument was a century away. He worked with naked eyes, better tables, and a mind that saw coordinate transformations, not as tricks, but as reality. He plugged Earth into a moving frame and watched the confusions align. He knew his critics would be loud. He wrote that astronomers seek causes and philosophers hunt for truth, and that young mathematicians would eventually test his numbers and judge him accordingly. He counted himself among those who reason more than those who vote. That blend of confidence and courtesy, backed by pages of calculations, survives as a template for how to change minds the slow way. The life that produced that book is worth rereading whenever science is presented as a parade of flamboyant geniuses. Copernicus was reserved, dutiful, economically literate, medically useful, administratively trusted, and occasionally stubborn. He moved stars on paper and soldiers in real time. He argued over coin quality. He translated Greek. He built an observatory wall with chalk. He tolerated an annoying preface because he might not have known it was coming. He made room in the sky for everyone else to discover what gravity does for a living. If a single image has to close the account, use this one. A February afternoon in Fromborg. He is past middle age, but still climbing stairs, 2 at a time. A cloak wrapped close, because the sea wind will not respect astronomers. He carries wax tablets and a straight edge. He notes the time, measures an angle, and bites back a grin that does not fit his face, because something just matched the prediction. The sun was exactly where his numbers said it would be. The thrill is small and private and enormous and global. It is the thrum under every subsequent discovery. He takes the stairs down to a meeting about taxes, leaves a note reminding himself to improve a parameter, and returns to work as if rearranging the cosmos in old buildings counts as normal. That is the tone of this revolution. Understated, icy, precise, and unstoppable. Later readers called him daring. Friends called him careful. Enemies called him fanciful. But every navigator who accepted modern tables and every student who learned that Earth is not the center owes him a nod. He changed how the night sky is imagined, and therefore how daylight looks when numbers stand behind it. The last unseen victory sits inside the phrase solar system. System is the word that matters. He gave the solar part meaning, and the system part necessity. Even the moon cooperates more clearly once the big frame is right. No temples crumble in this story. No empires kneel. A smaller revolution with better legs wins. The municipal minutes of Warmia still list him by office. The coin treatise still reads like a policy memo. The castle records still make him a steward during war. Between those lines, the mind went elsewhere, revised the map of all maps, and left instructions meticulous enough that others could form the planets in their heads with the right scale. That is why a grave marker showing an orbit diagram stands above his bones. He gave the sky a diagram that made the rest of science march. Moving on, our next tale is titled The Expansion of the Sassanian Empire, Persian Power. A Roman emperor once vanished into a Persian war camp and re-emerged as a trophy. Not a rumor, not a medieval myth. In 260 C, the Sassanian king Shapur I captured Emperor Valerian at Edessa and paraded the fact like a banner. Rock reliefs at Nakshi Rustam still carve the message in stone. Rome bleeds, Persia rises. The image of a kneeling emperor burns so bright in later memory that it eclipses the rest, but the wider truth lands harder. For 4 centuries the Sassanian Empire stood toe-to-toe with Rome and then Byzantium, traded with India and China, battled Huns and Turks, and shaped the political map from the Caucasus to the Persian Gulf. The other superpower didn't sit in Rome. It sat on the Tigris, under a giant brick arch at Ctesiphon. This power surge begins with a family from Fars who packaged ambition inside religious legitimacy and nostalgia. Ardashir, I, son of Papak, grandson or protege of a priest named Sassan, started as a local tough in the province, the Greeks called Persis. Around 224 CE he faced down the last Parthian king, Artabanasiv, at Hormozd Gan. According to later sources and rock reliefs near Firuzabad, the battle ended with Ardashir crowned, Artabanus dead, and a new dynasty planting its flag on an old idea. The Sassanian kings didn't claim to be innovators. They claimed to be restorers, heirs to the Achaemenids of Cyrus and Darius, the ancient royals. Alexander swore he defeated, but never erased from memory. Persian banners come back, Zoroastrian fire altars glow, and heavy cavalry returns to stomp the steppe-soft earth. Ardashir knew image work counts. He ringed his heartland with monuments. The fortress of Calais Doctor, the palace of Ardashir's fire by a lake at Firuzabad, and the circular city of Gur laid out with geometric nerve, making urban planning look like a chessboard. He also turned the capital into more than a palace. Ctesiphon on the Tigris, long the Parthian seat opposite Greek Seleucia, becomes the administrative engine, a city that breathed taxes and exhaled silver coins. But he didn't just sort out branding. He fought. He pressed into Mesopotamia, battled Rome, and established the contours of a rivalry that would burn up centuries of gold and a horrific amount of manpower. Ancient chroniclers like Herodian and later Al-Tabari stack up the campaigns in overlapping fragments. Through the fog, one thing shows clearly. A startup monarchy from Fars clobbered a decaying Parthian board and started poaching Roman territory with alarming confidence. Then Shapur walked in, and the volume dial snapped to maximum. Shapur, ruling from 240 to 270, moved like a man who reads maps as if they're shopping lists. Antioch fell to him, not once, twice. Roman soldiers got marched east in disciplined columns and turned into workers on Persian projects. The band Caesar at Shushtar, the Caesar's Dam, still carries the legend that Roman captives built it, harnessing the Karen River into irrigation grid. Archaeologists have argued over the degree of Roman engineering there, but the Sassanian brag remains granite solid in the tradition. Shapur also left the king's version of a LinkedIn resume at the Karbayi Zartosh, a traglingual inscription listing victories against Emperors Gordian III, Philip the Arab, and Valerian. He even claimed he made Valerian prisoner with my own hands. Procopius, centuries later, still sounded startled, and that shock doesn't fade. An emperor in Persian chains breaks the usual script of the classical world. Against this glare, another move gets less attention, but deserves a spotlight. Shapur captured people and resettled them, not as mindless brutality, but as geopolitical agriculture. Skilled artisans, merchants, and farmers were planted in new cities inside Persia. A famous case is the Antioch Shapur. Literally, better Antioch of Shapur, a deliberate nod that a conquered Syria now watered Persian fields and paid Persian taxes. This wasn't chaos sowing. It was statecraft, scaling the economy by forced urbanization. After Shapur, the knives came out inside the palace, as tends to happen when a monarchy realizes that one throne attracts 30 cousins. Successors Mabates triumphed, stumbled, or both. Narseh, an older prince passed over earlier, eventually took power in 293. He rolled the dice against Rome and lost big. Diocletian sent Galerius east. In 298, the Romans ambushed Narses' camp near Satala, capturing the royal harem and treasure. A humiliating treaty followed in 299. Persia ceded 5 satrapies beyond the Tigris and recognized Armenia as Rome's sphere. Ammianus Marcellinus, writing later, smiled in Latin at the memory. The pendulum had swung back. That pendulum never stopped. Sassanian history reads like a sword fight in a hall of mirrors. Rome here, steppe raiders there. Armenia in the middle, tax collectors somewhere underfoot. Religious politics glowing like hot coals. Through the 4th century, a long-reigning monarch stepped up and changed the tone. Shapur too, crowned in infancy, legendarily in the womb, with a royal diadem placed on his mother's belly, grew into a ruler whose record mocked his origin story. He spent 7 decades on the throne, 309, 379, battled Romans like a job, and hit the southern tribes with such force that Arab memory still called him Dhul Akhtar, he of the shoulders, for allegedly punishing rebels by piercing their shoulders. Not a gentle pre-move, but the point lands. Frontier management required more than a polite letter. The war with Rome, in his era, reads like a season-long series with too many cliffhangers. In 359, Shapur besieged Amida, modern Diyarbakir, Ammianus Marcellinus, an eyewitness and a soldier, wrote it with the eye of a war reporter. The Persians threw up siege works, hauled in elephants as living battering rams, and eventually stormed the city after a brutal campaign. A year later, Emperor Julian took the daring road straight toward Ctesiphon, torched the Persian fleet, and died under murky circumstances in June 363. Likely felled by a Persian spear. His successor Jovian scrambled for an exit and signed a treaty so harsh that Rome abandoned Nisibis, a key fortress city, and conceded ground along the Tigris. Persia recovered face and territory. That was the Sassanian game at its best. One punch to the gut, one punchline on a treaty. The rivalry wasn't confined to the big war front facing Roman legions. The Caucasus served as the rich kids' boarding school for every ancient power that wanted to pretend it cared about cavalry and theology. Armenia had converted to Christianity around 301. A sore point for a Zoroastrian empire that grounded royal legitimacy in divine fire. Persian kings wanted loyalty and cultural alignment. Armenian nobles wanted autonomy and a place at the big table. The tension bled into policy. In 451, during the reign of Yazdegerd III, Armenia exploded in revolt led by Vardan Mamikonian. The Battle of Avarai ended with Persian victory on the field, but long-term Armenian Christian autonomy survived. Later, Armenian chroniclers like Yegish framed it as a moral win. The Sassanian state learned a lesson. Pushing religious uniformity across fierce noble houses in the Caucasus cost more blood than it bought control. On the Eastern Front, a different wind howled. The Hephthalites, often labelled the White Huns, poured into the region in the 5th century like a reminder that stealth infantry is useless if the sky turns black with horse archers. Kings Yazdegerd II and Perizai fought them and lost more than patience. In 484, Perez died in a disastrous campaign. Some sources describe a trap, a ditch, and a Persian army swallowed by the earth, like a myth turned administrative memo. The consequence mattered more than the color of a Hun's tunic. Persia started paying tribute eastward, and a generation learned the taste of humiliation. That background makes Kavad I's career read like a chess puzzle with unfair time controls. He came to the throne in 488, got deposed by nobles fed up with his reforms, spent time in Hephthalite exile, returned with their help around 498 or 499, and retook power like the world's grimmest homecoming episode. His reign brought in the name that still ignites hot takes, Mazdak. The Mazdakite movement preached radical ethical and social reforms, redistribution, curbs on greed, communal obligations, ascetic tones with apocalyptic edge. Medieval writers love to describe it as sharing of women, a smear that modern scholars treat cautiously. The vibe, a challenge to aristocratic privilege, was real. Cavard flirted with Mazdakism as a political tool to neuter rebellious nobles. Then he backed away when the fire got too high. His son Khosrow I would later crush it, executing Mazdak around the 520s, in scenes later authors painted in technicolor. The reduction lies in equating Mazdakism to modern communism. The movement had religious layers and late antique flavors that don't collapse into easy slogans. But it rattled landed elites and left a mark on the memory of reform and reaction. Then the house got its genius administrator with an iron streak. Khosrow I Anushirvan, of the immortal soul, took the throne in 531, inherited a state jagged with frontier crises, and started rearranging everything from taxes to generals. Procopius, and later Arabic and Persian sources gush about him, partly with reason and partly with hindsight. He reformed the tax system toward a more rational land assessment, cutting the teeth of corrupt middlemen. He elevated the decans, local landholding gentry, the spine of governance, creating a social stratum invested in state stability. He divided the empire's defense into 4 frontier commands, each under a sparbd. The arrangement, north, south, east, west, made sense against raiders who didn't file their invasion forms in triplicate. He rebuilt canals in Kazakhstan, stabilized granaries, and strengthened urban centers. The Decans, later famous in early Islamic era literature, first shone under his method. Culture under Khosrow I pulls in its own orbit of legends. The academy at Gundeshapur, blending Greek, Syriac, and Indian scholarship, gets described as a proto-university. Some modern titles oversell it, but the translation movement happening in Persia was very real. Indian astronomical and mathematical knowledge moved west here. The board game, Chatrang, an ancestor of chess, appears in Pahlavi texts tied to Khosrow's court, alongside backgammon. Nard, played with a zeal that looks suspiciously like tax collector stress relief. Poets and sages got stipends. Persian silver plates gleamed with scenes of royal hunts, boars leaping from chased silver, as if trying to escape into a museum display case. The empire minted rivers of thin silver drachms, light, wide coins that weigh around 3.7 to 4.2 grams, stamped with a crowned bust and a fire altar on the reverse, with 2 attendants. Each coin told a little sermon. The king's face, the sacred flame, continuity hammered into silver. All of this would be gorgeous trivia if Khosrow I had stayed home. He didn't. The war with Byzantium reignited in the 520s. The Iberian War, 526-532, flared in the Caucasus. Procopius records the back and forth with relish. A truce came in, 532, with the so-called eternal peace. 11,000 pounds of gold crossed hands to buy that eternity, which then lasted roughly as long as eternal things do in late antiquity. In 540, Khosrow tore up the truce and raided Syria, taking Antioch and forcibly relocating part of its population to a suburb near Ctesiphon, called Way Antioch Khosrow. Khosrow's better Antioch. Battalion's Monophysite wife allegedly got. Meetings, theological schisms got exploited, and Persian armies moved like a cold front. Another long contest in Lazica, modern western Georgia, between 541 and 562 saw Persia and Byzantium fight over a Black Sea gateway, one valley at a time. The 562 treaty that followed, again dripped Byzantine gold into Persian coffers. Khosrow, I didn't only look west. He fixed the Hephthalites problem by picking better friends. Around 557, he formed an alliance with the rising power of the Turkic steppe, the Gurk Turks under Istemi, and pincered the Hephthalites out of existence. The Silk Road's northern arteries dangled like open veins ready for someone to pump. Sogdian merchants, expert in turning silk into profit, navigated between Turk and Persian spheres and Persian control over Armenia. Caucasian gates, like Derbent, and the Gorgon Wall secured the corridors. That Gorgon Wall wasn't a metaphor. Archaeologists have measured about 195 kilometers of fortification, a massive red brick line punctuated by over 30 forts, backing a carpet of canals and ditches. Eberhard Sauer's team has published on its scale. The Great Wall of Gorgon and the smaller Tamasheh Wall to the west show an empire that cared obsessively about step doors and how to lock them. Persia also reached toward Arabia by water, not just rumor. The province of Mazun, roughly covering Oman and the eastern Arabian coast, sat in the Persian orbit, and in the late 560s or 570s, during a Yemeni crisis, Khosrow sent a general named Fariz across the sea. Ethiopian Aksumite rule in Yemen had overstepped, local South Arabian elites revolted, and a Sassanian fleet and force shifted the balance. Syriac and Arabic chronicles, including Al-Tabari and the Chronicle of Sird, alongside South Arabian inscriptions, preserved this episode. Persian garrisons stood in Sana'a into the early 7th century. Trade with India rode those waters too. Pepper, aromatics, beads, and cotton weaving into Persian textiles and aristocratic kitchens. By this point, the empire looked like a monster of logistics wearing ceremonial gold. Its heart beat in Mesopotamia, in Asoristan, irrigated by canals, feeding a population base that funded heavy cavalry and thicker walls. Its lungs were the frontiers. In Derbent up north, the reed marshes of the south, the deserts screening Lakhmid Arab allies at Al-Hira, and the mountain knots of Khorasan in the east. The brain was the palace at Ctesiphon, crowned by the Taki Kisra, a colossal brick vault around 37 meters, 121 feet across. That arch still stands in partial ruin, like a ribcage showing the size of whatever animal once lived there. Religious policy powered the ideology. Zoroastrianism, worship of Ahura Mazda, sacred fire tended by the Magi, a cosmic struggle between truth, a Shah and the lie Drush, supplied state rhetoric and legal norms. Fire temples dotted the landscape, including the great complex of Tafti Solomon, where a royal fire, a Dor-Gushnasp, blazed for warriors and kings. Funerary practices that avoided corpse contamination show up in later accounts of Dakmas. Towers of silence, though the archaeological footprint for Sassanian era towers is uneven and care is needed with assumptions. The Avesta, the Zoroastrian scripture, was systematized in this period. Priesthoods and court officials functioned as partners, in theory. In practice, kingship had to navigate between priestly power, noble houses, and taxmen whose favorite prayer involved more silver. The myth that the Sassanians acted as cartoon villain persecutors collapses under the weight of evidence. The state supported Zoroastrian institutions. It also tolerated and regulated other communities, with complexities that swing over time. Jews in Mesopotamia lived under a recognized exarch, and the Babylonian Talmud's final redaction fell within Sassanian centuries. Christians formed the Church of the East after ecclesiastical schisms with the Roman Empire. East Syriac Christians in Persia studied, debated, and translated with a freedom that often increased when Byzantium looked particularly Catholic and suspicious. At intervals, particularly under Yazdegerd I, tolerance improved. Then a backlash hurt Christians when Roman-Persian War flared, and loyalty came under scrutiny. Waves of persecution struck hard under Yazdegerd II, and later accounts describe martyrs whose legends expanded with pious storytelling. The reality looks like jagged pragmatism, not a single line. One critical policy move that most schoolbook timelines skip deserves its own burst of neon. In 602, Khosrow II Parviz, descendant of kings, exceptionally stylish on his coins, abolished the Lakhmid Arab buffer kingdom at Al-Hira. The Lakhmids, clients for 2 centuries, had served as Persia's southern shock absorbers, intercepting raids and projecting influence through tribal networks. Khosrow replaced that delicate patronage system with direct rule. Historians argue about motives. The Lakhmid king Al-Numan III died in a conflict with Khosrow, or court intrigues triggered distrust. But the result mattered. The frontier now opened like a door on greased hinges. This decision would haunt the empire when the Islamic conquests began decades later. Khosrow too didn't start in stability. He came to the throne in 590, got ousted by the brilliant general Bahram Choban, and clawed back power in 591 with Byzantine help from Emperor Maurice. Then Maurice was murdered by the usurper Phocas in 602. Khosrow, taking vengeance as justification and smelling blood like a cat in a fish market, launched a megawar. Persian armies surged. In 613-614, they captured Damascus and Jerusalem. The true cross was seized and sent east, a trophy processed into imperial ideology. In 616-619, Sassanian commanders pushed down the Nile. By 619, Egypt, the granary of the Eastern Empire, fell under Persian control. In Asia Minor, cities like Chalcedon saw Persian banners across the Bosporus glinting like the wrong ending to an old story. Coins from this period sometimes carry crescents and stars, flanking the fire altar, while imperial mints ran overtime to pay for campaigns that reached nearly to Constantinople's doorstep. From a distance, it looked like the Achaemenid map had been reborn. Syria, Palestine, Egypt, Armenia, huge slices of the classical Roman East, now fed Persian treasuries and wrote letters to Persian satraps. But the shape of the victory tells the future. The empire's arms had outrun its belly. Long supply lines, costly garrisons, logistics bent to breaking, and court silks wrapped too tight around political factions. The new Byzantine emperor Heraclius didn't sit and mope. Beginning in 622, he launched a counter-offensive that felt like a myth rehorned into strategy. He marched through Armenia, allied with the Khazars and other steppe powers, and burned royal properties in Atropatene. In 626, Persian armies in Avars tried to break Constantinople together, but the city's walls, ships, and holy processions outlasted them. In December 627, Heraclius won at Nineveh against a Persian army under the general Razad. The sources, Theophylact, Simakhata, Cebeos, and later chroniclers, describe Heraclius chopping through the lines, the Persian general falling, and the war machine finally experiencing its own Edessa memory. By early 628, rebels in Persia overthrew Khosrow II. He was executed by his son, Kavadakh II. The throne turned into a chair that nobody could hold. Kings changed every few months. Famine and plague pressed the people. Tax revenues drained like water through a cracked jar. The 25-year war left both superpowers staggering. The Sassanians staggered closer to the cliff. The state had been built to manage multi-front diplomacy and sustained campaigning. It had not been built to swallow a permanent megawar that required simultaneous occupation of Syria, Egypt, Anatolia, and the Caucasus. Elite infighting reached absurd levels. The nightly Aswaran, the elite cavalry, were still lethal in theory. On paper, they looked like a late antique Special Forces brochure. Armored horse and rider a long Conto's lance held, in two hands, composite bows, sometimes elephant core, bringing intimidation like a drumbeat. But paper isn't payroll. With a scorched treasury and no Lakhmid buffer, the empire had holes. Then the Arab conquests broke across the southern horizon. The Rashidun Caliphate's armies entered in the early 630s, not as aimless raiders, but as an organized state with mobile cavalry and a lean command structure. They exploited the exact seams Sassanian kings had once mended with money and client networks. In 634, Persian forces were beaten at places like the Battle of Walaja and Ole. In 600, at Qadisi, a pitched fight wrecked the Persians' main field army. Arabic and Persian chronicles, Al-Tabari among them, paint epic scenes of elephants terrified by trickery and charges. The chroniclers write with the energy of moral story. Archaeologists still wrestle with details. Regardless of heroic flourishes, the result holds. In early 637, Ctesiphon fell. The Palace of Arches, the River of Silver Drex, they changed hands. In 642, the decisive blow came at Narvan, nicknamed by Muslim tradition the Victory of Victories. Yazdegerd III, the last Sassanian king, fled east. He was murdered near Merv in 651. The dynasty ended. The royal fire altars fell under new governors, and yet so much kept going in disguised forms that any straight-line narrative short-circuits. That final collapse breeds myths that need careful trimming. One myth claims Islam rolled over a decadent, helpless Persia without breaking a sweat. The reality shows a fatigued, fragmented empire still fighting ferociously in the field, then disintegrating mainly because internal glue failed. Another myth claims the Sassanians ignored the Arabs. Khosrow's earlier abolition of the Lakhmid kingdom and Persian garrisons in eastern Arabia and Yemen show deep entanglement, not ignorance. The Sassanian state had studied the region for centuries. It simply miscalculated. And by 636, the bill arrived. To understand why Sassanian power worked as long as it did, the mechanics need a closer look. The economy sat on irrigated agriculture in Mesopotamia, Khuzestan, and Fars. The Shushtar hydraulic system, with dams and canals including the famous Band Kaisar, drove a water wheel of surplus that bought armies. The Karen and Tigris Euphrates networks supplied not only food, but freight routes. Persian coinage, especially under later kings like Khosrow I and Khosrow II, poured out as payroll and propaganda. Numismatists can date a reign by flipping a Sassanian drachm. Mint marks in Pahlavi letters, regnal years, flames on the reverse that serve as state icon. These drachms crop up far from the Tigris, hordes in Central Asia, single finds in the Caucasus. Imitations in India, showing tax cycles and trade long before modern states learned how to harass citizens with audits. Administration worked because it accepted that control means managing elites, not replacing them. The satrapal model, the very term, satrap, an Achaemenid hand-me-down, got updated. The Wuzurg Framadar, a sort of grand vizier, helped centralize decisions. The court fostered key noble houses, rewarded loyalty, married strategically, and sometimes killed with equal strategy. The king's most reliable allies were money, ideology, and the Deccan class that lived on provincial estates and collected taxes like they were personal hobbies. Fortifications flaunted ambition. The Gorgon Wall has already taken its bow, but Derbent in the Caucasus deserves a shout. The Caspian Gates at Derbent, a stone stronghold that narrows the pass between mountains and sea, advertises Sassanian engineering to every migrating group that ever dreamed of moving south. Persian kings also threw up barrier works in Sistan and Ray. The idea wasn't to create a medieval Chinese behemoth, so much as to slow raiders and concentrate them into killing grounds, where heavy cavalry could do the interview. Militarily, the Sassanians loved a combined arms toolkit. Heavy lancers punctured enemy lines. Horse archers harassed flanks. Infantry from Dalim in the Caspian Mountains fought as shock troops in close terrain. Elephant corps, when used wisely, terrified cavalry that preferred not to get trampled by a 6-ton argument. The Romans adapted, borrowing cataphract armor and new siege techniques in an arms race that equals anything in modern military R&D. Ammianus writes of Persian siege towers and testudos. Procopius notes clever tunneling. Both sides learned from each other, like rivals who copy homework and then pretend they invented math. On cultural soft power, the Sassanians played the long game. Court etiquette shimmered with ceremony. The King of Kings didn't take casual meetings. Audiences took place through layers of protocol, curtains, and translators of mood. Gifts were displays of sovereignty, not just trinkets, but declarations that you existed in a hierarchy, with someone else at the top. Persian textiles and silver dazzled foreign courts. Sassanian motifs, the winged crown, beaded ribbons, crescents, leaked into Byzantine art. Not everything was war. Some contact was culture piggybacking on the back of diplomacy. Render unto Persia the things that make your living room more stylish. Debunking isn't a mood killer here. It raises the drama. One popular story says, Khosrow too conquered Constantinople. He did not. He scared it. He surrounded parts of it with allies, and his standards glinted in sight of its walls across the straits. But Constantinople stayed Byzantine, locked behind Theodosian walls, and by 626 defended fiercely with help from the city's fleet and anger levels. Another evergreen tale says Alexander's conquest burned all Zoroastrian scripture, and the Sassanian kings had to reinvent an entire religion from charred memory. The textual tradition is more layered. Some loss is likely, some later exaggeration. A living priestly heritage compiled and canonized under the Sassanians in ways that pretended to resurrect an earlier whole. Restoration served political magic. Claiming the mantle of Cyrus and Darius wrapped new power in revered cloth. The choice of a fire temple next to coin icons wasn't subtle. The Armenian question, often framed as pure religious oppression, reads better when described as a multi-century negotiation in which both sides weaponized identity. Persian pressure to adopt Zoroastrian norms sometimes turned brutal. Armenian nobles oscillated between alliance and revolt, depending on which overlord offered better tax breaks and who just killed which cousin. Faustus of Byzantium, in the 5th century, writes like a dramatist of family feuds with spears. The outcome matters. By late Sassanian times, Persian rule over Armenia functioned through a Marsbon, governor, with negotiated autonomy that recognized Christian worship as a stubborn fact. That is geopolitical maturity, more than confession, but the result shaped Armenian survival well beyond 651. Another favorite simplification imagines a Roman-dominated Mediterranean, with Persia as a footnote. The mirror image shows up just as often, with Rome as a perpetual punching bag. The reality laughs at caricature. Parity defined the middle centuries. Geographers from China knew of Bosi, the Persians. Sogdian letters from the early 4th century mentioned trouble on the Silk Road tied to Xiongnu raids, and by the 6th, Turkic envoys to Constantinople cut deals meant to undercut Persian monopoly. The world recognized two mega-players haggling over a continental marketplace. Phoenician purple competed with Persian silk. Byzantine diplomats tried to bypass Persian tolls by shipping silk through the Red Sea, negotiating with Aksum in Ethiopia, and with steppe nomads like they were running a startup out of a canoe. Meanwhile, Persian fleets and governors stabilized Gulf routes. The system was so interconnected that a plague in Egypt, the Justinianic plague starting in 541, killed tax farmers in Syria and soldiers in Mesopotamia. Even if numbers vary wildly in sources, the economic hit struck both empires with a hammer. In Persia, the disease recurred through the 540s and 550s peeling population and tax base. A silent killer that makes later fiscal panics less surprising. Material culture offers a last vivid tour. Sassanian art, loved movement. Royal silverware shows boar hunts and rams caught mid-turn. Kings in flowing tunics drawing bows at full gallop. A plate in the Hermitage Museum shows Khosrow's spearing game. The garments detailed enough to make fashion bloggers cry. Stucco ornaments in palaces at Ctesiphon show palmats and grape clusters that later Islamic artisans echo in mosque decor. The famous arch at Ctesiphon, Take Kisra, isn't just a ruin. It's an advertisement for Sassanian brick engineering, unsure of gravity and uninterested in modesty. Fire temples at places like Bishopur had square holes with domes fed by squinches, architectural techniques that the Islamic world then perfected. Legitimate continuity threads run through conquest and beyond. Sassanian coin imagery, the ruler's frontal bust with winged crown, astral symbols, and fire altar, morphed into early Islamic silver dirhams that imitated Sassanian models before Arabic inscriptions took over. Continuity and rupture, simultaneously in the palm of a hand. Back to expansion. The headline act, the 1st century of Sassanian rule, extended lines west into Roman Syria and Armenia. The 2nd century stabilized and fortified east while pressing the Caucasus. The 3rd century under Khosrow I and I saw a state that could project power to Yemen, knock out Central Asian rivals, and hold Egypt for a decade. That is a vertical leap from 224's provincial warlord. The moves weren't random seizures. They were part of a strategy that kept the empire safe and rich. Westward pushes took cities and captives. Eastward diplomacy killed a threatening confederation and plugged the Silk Road's bleeding arteries. Southern engagement ceded influence across the Arabian shore and into the Red Sea nodes. Northern walls controlled steppe, doorways. Each frontier was a lever. The rulers themselves turned into emblems of policy. Duecento ventiquattro, Duecento quarantuno. Consolidator, killed a dying order, sold a revival myth, built iconic Fars monuments. Got in Rome's face early so everyone understood that the new brand had teeth. Shapur I Ra 240, 270. The anvil, trampled Antioch, captured Valerian, planted resettled populations, carved victory records on royal rock faces, pushed a model of power married to infrastructure. Narse 293, 302. Warning sign, pushed too far, got beaten by Rome, lost territory in 299. Proof that Persia could be humiliated when competence dipped. Shapur 309, 379. Long game king, fought Romans to a strategic standoff, hit southern Arabs hard, secured frontiers, and came out with Nisibis in Persian hands. A reversal of 299's humiliation. Perros, I, 459, 484. Tragedy lesson. Died against Hephthalites, forced Persia to pay Eastern tribute. A reminder that the steppe-shaped outcomes, more than Mediterranean storytellers like to admit. Covered. I. 488, 531. Reset button. Balanced reform with calculated religious politics. Came back from exile with outsider allies, and fathered a different kind of state. Khosrow I. 551, 579. The architect, reorganized tax, military command, and frontier strategy, sacked Antioch, fixed the Hephthalite mess, invested in walls and canals, Netflix being worthy if Procopius were a cinematographer. Khosrow II. Boh, 590, 628. The gambler, lost his throne, regained it with Byzantine help. Then, after Maurice's assassination, went on a rampage that took Jerusalem and Egypt and wrecked the fiscal chassis of the empire. Fell in a palace coup while Heraclius burned estates in Adurbadagan and Media. Every story about Sassanian Persia eventually runs into Ctesiphone's shadow. Step inside that mental city. The court thrums with music and petitions. Adia Khan from Kazakhstan seeks a tax reassessment because locusts wrecked a harvest. A general from Khorasan reports a Turk raid, probed and repelled. Armenian nobles wait 3 rooms away, calculating oaths. A Jewish exilarch negotiates community obligations. A Nestorian bishop translates Aristotle in Syriac by daylight and argues about Christology by candlelight. Magi whisper over legal codes that govern inheritance and purity. Silver coins clink in sacks labelled with mint marks from Bishopur and Merv. Ivory from India shows up in a chest, stamped with a governor's seal. Out in the hunting park, the paradiser that gives modern languages the word paradise, the king shoots arrows at lions, while musicians perform pieces that later poets will still celebrate. This is not a regional backwater. This is a superpower with paperwork. Then, because history has a wicked sense of comedy, the Sassanian story ends with a sprint of kings so fast that even professional historians need spreadsheets. From 628 to 632, the throne spins. Kavada, Shir, Kru, Hai Shabaraz, Boran, Shapuraz, Azamidakht, Khosrow III, and finally Yazdegerd III in 632. A queen like Boran, Khosrow II's daughter, tries to restore justice and tax equity. Coins show her with a diadem and the familiar fire altar, an extraordinary artifact of a woman on the Sassanian throne. It wasn't enough. The state skeleton cracked. Regional elites peeled away. Once the Iswaran stopped riding as a single hammer, the nails stuck out everywhere. The long memory, though, did not die. Early Islamic administration in Iraq adopted Sassanian tax and land practices with remarkable speed. Arab governors leaned on Persian secretaries, the Daikon's grandsons, to record Diwan accounts, collect Karaj land tax, and keep canals flowing. Silver coins continued for decades in imitation forms, with Sassanian-style busts overstruck with Arabic in Bismillah. Courtly literature in Arabic and Persian retold stories of Khosrow and his court. The Shahnameh, composed centuries later by Ferdowsi, turned Sassanian kings into epic characters, flattening complexities into poetic archetypes. But under the verse, the administrative habits, architectural techniques, and cultural tastes survived and mutated. Empires do not evaporate. They dissolve, and the residue stains everything built on top. Evidence supports this reach at every point. Inscriptions like Shapur eyes at the Kaaba-ye-Zardosht lay out victories without medieval filters. Coins in hoards from Central Asia tell the lines of trade and show the breadth of Persian mints. Archaeology at the Great Wall of Gorgan and Derbent counts bricks and measures grams of mortar, so future history teachers don't have to wave their hands. Roman writers like Ammonius and Procopius, Armenian chroniclers like Cebeos, Persian, and Arabic compilers like Al-Tabari, Syriac church histories. The Chronicle of Khuzestan, all of them disagree and contradict in places, but together they triangulate a picture of a state moving on multiple axes. Comparison and skepticism sharpen the image, not blur it. From the first expansion under Ardashir to the world-conquering fantasy under Khosrow II, the Sassanian Empire's growth wrote a play in act. Scene 1, Restoration myth and Far's conquest. Scene 2, Shock and awe under Shapur I, a captured emperor as trophy. Scene 3, Roman counterpunch and lost provinces, the humility rehearsal. Scene 4, Shapur, soul on war and regained stature, tokened by Nisibis on the balance sheet. Scene 5, Eastern humiliation and reformist experiments undercovered, a near-miss disaster turned diagnostic test. Scene 6, Khosrow I's golden machinery, reorganized defenses, Antioch in Persian embrace, Heft-Hoplites erased from the map. Scene 7, the Khosrow II hurricane, a map colored Persian to a degree not seen since Darius, then burnt at the edges by Heraclius. Final scene, exhaustion, palace coups, southern riders on fast horses, and a fire altar flickering out in Ctesiphon as the Tigris keeps flowing like nothing happened. The jokes practically write themselves, if gallows humor counts as comedy. A superpower obsessed with frontier wars collapses because it fired its best buffer on the open desert front. A dynasty that advertised itself as the rebirth of Cyrus ends with a final king, Yazdegerd III, reportedly scraping coins from provincial treasuries and begging for allegiance in the east while local nobles calculate exchange rates on betrayal. A religion that prized order could not impose it on court politics long enough to fill a grain silo. Meanwhile, coins still looked crisp, because mints don't panic until the furnaces go cold. Power in late antiquity didn't look like a graph, trending smoothly upward. It looked like a surgeon's heartbeat monitor during a storm. Sudden spikes, terrifying crashes, and then a flat line only at the very end. Persia's Sassanian expansion didn't just pump fear into Roman senates and Byzantine war rooms. It rewired trade routes, fortified passes, stamped coins across 2 continents, and forced faiths to coexist and compete under a state that cared as much about canals as it did about cavalry. Every time the empire flexed, someone else's narrative cracked. Stand again at Naksh-e-Rustam, where ancient Achaemenid tombs loom above Sassanian carvings. On one relief, Shapur I sits tall on a rearing horse, while a Roman emperor's hand reaches up in a gesture that artists argue about and tour guides oversimplify. The relief says one thing with violent confidence. The center of gravity in the 3rd century had shifted eastward. Then walk mentally down the Tigris to Ctesiphon and feel the space under the Taki Kisra, the kind of space that makes people whisper because they feel small. It was built to make people feel small. The empire that arched it into being was built to keep envoys, raiders, rebels, and tax collectors in orbits calculated with ruthless math. But wait, The impulse to treat the Sassanians as Rome's mirror hides an even cooler angle. Persia and Rome were not clones. They evolved different solutions to the same problems. Rome leaned on urban municipal traditions and a legalistic citizen empire morphing into a Christian bureaucratic machine. Persia leaned on estate-based aristocracy, priestly law, and an ideology forged in an older fire. The interface created sparks, the kind that light up entire regions. When those sparks finally ignited a blaze, both empires felt the heat. The difference was that by 630, Byzantium still had a walled capital on a defensible sea route with a disciplined fleet. Persia had a palace exposed on a low river plain with its aristocracy feuding 10 minutes after the coronation. None of this reduces the Sassanian achievement. It sharpens it. A state born from a provincial revolt against Parthian fragmentation built a 4th-century order that matched Rome, cemented the Silk Road into a workable pipeline, and could launch and sustain expansions sharp enough to shatter a Roman emperor's dignity on the battlefield and reorder the politics of the Near East. When it fell, its ghost lingered in coin shapes, in palace forms, in irrigation networks, in words. Paradise as a garden, chess as a courtly pastime, the arch at Ctesiphon as an architectural dare. These are not Roman legacies. History loves winners, but it loves good losers more. The Sassanian Empire expanded not as a single lunge, but as a practiced series of feints, charges, and consolidations. It grew when rulers blended iron with calculation, and when the treasury kept pace with the glint in a king's eye. It faltered when zeal outran grain, and when buffers turned into empty spaces. It left marks on marble, silver, brick, and book. And because those marks run through Middle Eastern, Central Asian, and even European currents, every map of late antiquity that paints the Mediterranean blue and leaves Persia in a beige block deserves hostile editing. The story begins with a showdown in 224 and explodes with a captured emperor in 260. It climbs walls in the Caucasus, crosses waters to Yemen, dashes across Armenia with Heraclius, and dies hard near Merv in 651. It contains dams built with probably Roman hands, and coins stamped so thin they look like metal leaves. It holds a theology of fire and a bureaucracy of mud and reeds. It pushed west until it held Jerusalem and Alexandria. It pushed east until Turkic alliances redrew Central Asia. It remains one of the most successful exercises in imperial expansion and control before gunpowder, and it did it with cataphracts, canals, and a staggering amount of paperwork. A person searching for Persian power doesn't need to touch a myth. The facts already sound like exaggerations. Our journey through history continues with the influence of Hypatia, Alexandria's last scholar. Alexandria breathes heat and politics in March 415, the kind of month when the Nile wind fails and tempers do the opposite. She rides in a carriage, because walking across this city's social battlefield counts as bad planning for anyone with influence and a spine. Her name is Hypatia, daughter of Phaon, mathematician, philosopher, and the kind of public intellectual who can give a lecture in the open air and make the noise of a Mediterranean port shut up for a minute. She is pulled from that carriage near a church called the Caesareum by men who shout about piety while grabbing tiles and pottery shards. They strip her, slaughter her inside a building devoted to a Prince of Peace, tear her body apart with those shards, and burn what remains at the edge of the city's imperial temple complex. Socrates Scholasticus records the shock in his ecclesiastical history around the 440s and states the leader's name, Peter the Lector. A single sentence in Greek carries the punch of the whole scene, as if the words still stare back. During Lent, She was seized, dragged, murdered, and her body burned. The headlines in a modern feed would write themselves, and Alexandria would trend for all the wrong reasons. Murder of a civilian celebrity by a fanatical mob. Weaponized rumor in an era of no DMs, only loud streets. A scholar turned symbol, then turned hashtag for centuries, without a single word online. The event is terrifying and cinematic, but it is also the end of a long fuse, lit by politics, fear, and the kind of overconfidence that swirls when religion and city government both believe they are the main character in the empire, but hold that bonfire of pottery shards. The story of influence begins far from the Caesareum. Hypatia grows up in the late 4th century, likely in the 360s. The documents refuse to deliver a precise birthday because late antiquity did not issue press releases for newborns. But scholars place her birth between 355 and 370. Her father is Theon of Alexandria, a mathematician and astronomer whose brand sounds exactly like a math influencer before ring lights existed. He edits Euclid's Elements into the form that becomes a standard textbook for a millennium. He produces commentaries on Ptolemy's handy tables, those astronomical cheat sheets that let you compute the positions of the sun, moon, and planets without building a planetarium in your backyard. He writes under his own name, and sometimes under a team identity that looks suspiciously like father-daughter studio credits. The line between co-author and editor in the 4th century is blurrier than the horizon. At noon on a dusty Alexandrian day, Hypatia's instruction is not a casual homeschooling setup. Theon trains her in mathematics and astronomy, and she studies philosophy in the late Platonist tradition. She learns to read not just lines but diagrams, not just grammar but geometry. She steps into a city that loves arguments more than bread and has a remarkable talent for turning them into riots. Alexandria, by 400 C, stands as the Eastern Roman Empire's noisy, wealthy, and strategic third city after Constantinople and maybe Antioch, depending on who is counting. Population estimates range into the hundreds of thousands. A dense stew of Greek-speaking elite, Coptic locals, Jews with centuries of community roots, pagan temple-goers navigating a shrinking world, and an ascendant Christian church eager to demonstrate both care for the poor and control over the streets. The city solves problems with debate until debate needs backup. And then the backup arrives in the form of monks from the Nitrian desert who hit like a freight caravan and cry out for the glory of God as they do it. She comes into her stride as a public teacher in the 390s. Damascius, a Neoplatonist, writing in the 6th century in his Life of Isidore, known today through Photius's 9th century summary, describes her as wearing the philosopher's mantle and teaching publicly in the center of Alexandria. He paints a picture that endures because it is both plausible and frankly stylish. She is a woman taking up civic space wearing the uniform of reasoned argument, speaking to elite students and curious bystanders, not hiding in a private salon. She reportedly travels in a carriage through town. The carriage becomes a symbol because it looks like a public stage with wheels, an elevated claim to dignity and visibility that no one with an ounce of caution would attempt in a city where politics heats faster than clay under the Egyptian sun. Myth creeps in fast even while she is alive. The library romance starts playing early. People like stories where a single righteous figure holds the line for all of human knowledge. And Alexandria's brand as the home of the great library arrives like a franchise reboot every couple of generations. The reality is untidy. The famous Mausian and its original library suffered losses long before Hypatia's time. The Serapeum, a grand temple, that also housed books, fell in 391 when Roman authorities enforced Theodosius I's decrees against pagan rites, and Patriarch Theophilus seized the chance to stage a historic demolition. That dramatic destruction, attested by writers like Rufinus and Sozomen, is nearly a quarter century older than Hypatia's death. She does not die guarding shelves of scrolls from a torch-wielding squad. In 415, she dies because a rumor claims she stands between the city's governor and its bishop. Meanwhile, the homework continues. Hypatia's intellectual footprints show up across a cluster of texts that were already old when she was born. The Suda, a 10th century Byzantine encyclopedia, credits her with commentaries on Diophantus's Arithmetica, on Apollonius's Conics, and on Ptolemy's astronomical canon, the Handy Tables. In an age where commentaries are both scholarship and software patch notes, this matters. She is explaining dense tools to a new generation, straightening diagrams, refining notation, and, according to scholarly consensus, making calculations friendlier for actual use. Everybody likes the genius inventor narrative, but late antique mathematics grows because people like Hypatia keep the engine well-oiled, correct bugs, and write new prefaces that say, "Here is how to use this instrument," without crying. Her inbox, to the extent that real letters count as an inbox, reflects that role. Synesius of Cyrene, a wealthy student who loves hunting, writes to her in the early 400s, then becomes a bishop around 410 in Ptolemais, Cyrenaica. He calls her mother, sister, teacher, and benefactress in a tone that combines philosophy and fan mail. He writes about an astrolabe, that two-dimensional model of the heavens made of concentric plates and sliding pointers, which had been around in Greek and Islamic astronomy for centuries by then. He asks her for advice, offers a treatise, and credits her expertise. He mentions a hydroscope, essentially a hydrometer for measuring liquid density, and asks her to calibrate it, or at least oversee its construction. No social network algorithm highlights the comment, but the letters show the practical edge of her teaching. She is not just telling people to contemplate the one like a marble statue. She is showing an episcopal aristocrat how to build a gadget. The instrument story sparks one of those persistent myths that refuse to retire. She did not invent the astrolabe. Greek scientists describe concepts for it already in the Hellenistic period, and Ptolemy's Almagest in the 2nd century leans on similar projections. Islamic astronomers will push astrolabe design far beyond anything imagined by Alexandria's workshops. But she did build and teach with them, which is messy, beautiful truth. A teacher who assembles devices with her students is worth more to history than a poster child who only exists in slogans. She also does not invent algebra, whole cloth from Diophantus's Arithmetica. That text, which includes problems that look to modern eyes like rational solutions to indeterminate equations, already existed. What she does, as far as the sources allow, is smooth and clarify. A modern audience knows the power of a good tutorial. She produces some of antiquity's best. Humor peeks through the seriousness, because late antique philosophers have the instincts of stand-up comedians, working rooms full of civil servants. Damascius preserves an anecdote that modern readers bring up with raised eyebrows and a grudging smile. A wealthy student courts her, apparently a persistent romantic enthusiast. She confronts him not with sweet nothings, but with a sanitary cloth and a pointed lesson in anatomy versus illusion. The point is not subtle. He is in love with the idea of her, not with the actual composite of body and soul standing in front of him. She insists on the life of the mind and the freedom to teach without playing Alexandria's favorite social game of arranged alliances. The anecdote is not guaranteed to be historically neat in its details. It comes from a philosopher's memory filtered through a later compiler. Even softened, it reads like late antique comedy with a punchline that carries a baseball bat. Chastity for her is discipline, not coyness. Philosophers in her circle still use the ancient vocabulary of virtue that treats sexual restraint as a mental superpower, and she performs it on a civic stage crowded with sharp elbows. All of this unfolds under a sky rendered more complex by imperial law and urban turf wars. Christianity is not a scrappy outsider in Alexandria by 400. It is the dominant force. The bishop's chair holds more street power than any official job title suggests. Cyril of Alexandria takes that chair in 412 after his uncle Theophilus, the same Theophilus who led the demolition of the Serapeum, dies. Cyril is brilliant, administratively ruthless, and relentlessly confident about what belongs to the church. These skills propel him to the center of world-shaping events. Later, like the Council of Ephesus in 431, where he leads the charge against Nestorius. The same talents also make him a problem inside Alexandria when he treats the port as his personal testing ground for hardball ecclesiastical politics. Opposite Cyril stands Orestes, the imperial prefect. Orestes represents the Emperor Theodosius II in Constantinople, which sounds glamorous but plays in Alexandria like touring theatre with guards. He holds the power of law and tax farming. Cyril holds moral authority and a private army of men who hop from managing soup kitchens to crowd control without blinking. The Parabolani, nominally appointed to care for the sick and bury the dead, function as a diaconal militia when required. The law will try to cap their number at 500 with a rescript in 416. Because even Constantinople has limits to how many club-wielding orderlies the empire can tolerate inside one city. Another crew, the Nitrian monks, operates like spiritual special forces. They descend from the desert in packs, wrap the city's politics in hair shirts and dust, and swing improvised weapons in the name of holiness. The timeline melts into menace faster than an ice cup left out in the Egyptian sun. In 414, intercommunal tension between Jews and Christians in Alexandria explodes. The details come mostly from ecclesiastical historians, so every paragraph reads like a controlled burn of blame. But a riot breaks out during a festival at the theatre. People die. Cyril marshals Christians. Orestes tries to assert control and maintain the legal order. Cyril expels many Jews from the city, seizing their synagogues for Christian use. Orestes protests to the emperor. The two men now operate in a contest to see whose will rules Alexandria. Humility does not arrive. The next incident looks like something a pulp fiction writer would reject for being too on the nose. A group of Nitrian monks confronts Orestes in the street. They surround his carriage, scream that he is a pagan despite his public Christianity, and one monk named Ammonius throws a stone that splits his head open. The prefect and his escort survive. Barely. Orestes has Ammonius arrested and tortured to death, an action that in imperial legalese counts as routine and in moral language looks like retribution. Cyril then calls Ammonius a martyr and celebrates him with honors. The city cringes. Even Christians who enjoy a show understand that this pushes boundaries. The pushback works and Cyril backs off the cult. The monks return to the desert. The powder kegs remain stacked in the warehouse, under a lantern that smokes and sputters. In that cauldron sits Hypatia, famous, female, pagan, and plugged into high-level power. Socrates says Orestes consults her because of her wisdom. He also says rumor spreads that she is the obstacle to reconciliation between the prefect and the bishop. Some accuse her of magic, of sorcery, of corrupting Orestes with enchantments. The line between philosophy and magic in the popular imagination is thinner than a papyrus fiber, and enemies use it with precision. Hypatia's hold on the city's imagination makes her the perfect scapegoat. No armed retinue rides along with her carriage large enough to counter a crowd inflamed by rhetoric and rumors. The wrong street at the wrong time becomes the last street she ever rides. Her death in Lent, 415, joins a grim catalogue of Alexandria's civic violence. The precinct where it happens matters. The Caesareum started life as a temple to the imperial cult, a shrine to the emperor in a city that knew both pragmatic politics and pious flattery. Christians repurpose it into a church during the 4th century. For a woman teaching mathematics and philosophy, dragged into that space and cut down with potsherds and tile fragments, the symbolism screams itself hoarse. Socrates writes that the instigators later suffer punishment, but he is short on detail, possibly because his narrative aims to illustrate moral consequence more than legal exactness. The result on the ground looks like this. Orestes exits the stage not long afterward. Cyril remains. Imperial edicts in 416 restrict the Parabolani and keep them out of civic council meetings. The cathedral keeps its bishop, who will end his career not as a defendant, but as a saint, canonized and celebrated in the Catholic Church and Eastern Orthodoxy as a doctor of the Church. Modern eyes often make Hypatia into a martyr of science against religion, a fable where rationality gets cornered by superstition and the torch wins. That parable flatters a lot of audiences. It is also too neat for Alexandria's mess. Many of her most devoted students are Christian. Wonder. Synesius, the bishop, loves her. He writes hymns and letters that combine the creed with Platonic metaphysics, and he does not treat her as a pagan other. The city's politics, not the data tables in her commentary, get her killed. She stands as a symbol of a civic order, where government officials seek counsel from philosophers, and that symbol threatens a bishop who insists the city's moral compass comes calibrated by the church. It is an intra-Christian and intra-imperial power fight with a pagan scholar at the center. Like a lightning rod. The lightning obeys local weather. It does not strike because the stars offended anyone. Still, her work matters beyond the blow-by-blow of 415. Inside the some assembly required history of mathematics, Hypatia holds a soldering iron, Diophantus's Arithmetica, a collection of algebra-like problems and methods, written probably in the 3rd century CE. Survives in a partial Greek corpus and becomes a seed for later algebra in the Arabic-speaking world, and then in early modern Europe. Hypatia's commentary, though lost, stands as an interpretive bridge. Suda's record matters because medieval scholars, hungry for authority, catalogue not only authors, but also authorized interpreters. In that tradition, commentary creates canonicity. Think of her as a verified account in the ancient math community, someone whose notes reshaped how readers handled the text. She likely standardizes notations, unravels the steps between compact sentence and full solution, and paves the way for learners to stay engaged rather than bail out after line 3. Her name also attaches to Apollonius's Conics, a treatise from the 2nd century Bas that frightens honest geometry students and delights astronomers. The conic sections, ellipse, parabola, hyperbola, become the heart of orbital mechanics later, but in late antiquity they carry geometric significance and aesthetic obsession. Eutychius of Ascalon in the 6th century writes commentaries that quote earlier scholiasts, and Hypatia's name floats in that commentary tradition like a buoy. She appears as an authority linked to the conics, which signals that her school took on the scary books. No one plants their flag on Apollonius, who plans to run a low-stress math salon. Then there is Ptolemy's astronomical canon, the handy tables. These are not essays on the meaning of life. They are spreadsheets before spreadsheets existed, lists of numbers used to track the movements of celestial bodies as mapped by geocentric models. Dion's work on them survive. And Theon refers in one preface to an edition prepared with the assistance of my daughter Hypatia. The line is gold because it demolishes any argument that her role was solely decorative. Theon, a man, not shy about taking credit for his editorial labor, writes her into the preface. If he is proud enough to include her name, then she did enough, that excluding it would feel dishonest. The tables survive in Greek and later Arabic forms, and the methods they teach hold sway in practical astronomy for centuries, even long after the theory behind them yields to heliocentrism. Somewhere in the long life of those numbers, the pressure of her hand remains. The teaching itself looks less like a faculty meeting and more like a social network with actual speeches. Students come from across the Mediterranean world. They sit in the same room, copy notes, and carry the brand home to Cyrenaica or Constantinople or wherever their family money and imperial service demands they live. Hypatia becomes Alexandria's intellectual export manager. She is a person and a symbol and a license to quote letters from Synesius in the 410. Remind her to send him books, to help him with scientific instruments, and to offer counsel on ramble-worthy topics like dreams or providence. He loves myth and cares about geometry. In his letters, the line between bishop and old-school Platonist blurs into something that would horrify later centuries and delight anyone who enjoys a complicated personality. Her public profile wins her enemies, and also fans. Damascius gushes that she is not only the best in geometry and astronomy, but also in politics, which is ancient shorthand for city management, not party platforms. She is a civic councillor, without a salary, and with far more applause than most ministers receive. People repeat that she walked through town in the philosopher's mantle, because, in Alexandria, clothing performs like a press release. Cynics wear rags. Philosophers wear a tribon, a thin cloak that says, "I devote myself to discourse and not to baths." The image of Hypatia in that mantle staggers modern expectations for women in public life in the 5th century. It also irritates men who consider any woman speaking in public a cosmic insult. It respects nothing to note that those men exist and that they do not stay quiet. Alexandria's underlying absurdities would make for a sharp, late-night monologue if late-night TV booked a theatre in the Forum. The city has a ready-made cast of stereotypes, and they all turn out to be real. The bishop who runs welfare and the streets, the governor who runs the courts and tries not to die in them, the monks who appear from the desert, like a playable character with the berserker trait, the scholars who can prove an ellipse in the morning and get lynched by lunchtime, the grain ships to Constantinople that must arrive on time, or everyone in the emperor's capital starts asking where the bread went. Volatility with a logistics problem attached. That is Alexandria under Theodosius II. Through the nonsense, a clear line runs. Hypatia's influence does not end in 415, because learning is stubborn. Her name returns centuries later, whenever Europe and the Mediterranean rediscover their ancient sources. The Renaissance raises her like a banner for humanist recovery. She becomes a favorite of Enlightenment critics of ecclesiastical power. Voltaire drops her into his philosophical dictionary in 1764 and retells the story with his usual venom and witty moralizing, pressing her into a symbol of clerical intolerance. Edward Gibbon in The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Volume 6, in 1788, lingers on the gruesomeness of her death to illustrate the coarsening of civic life. He sets the scene with talent, cites Socrates' Scholasticus, and resolves the event into the kind of judgment his readers buy with pleasure. Victorian England then produces Charles Kingsley's novel Hypatia in 1853. A sprawling melodrama that wraps her in romance and invented subplots because the Victorians cannot help themselves. The novel helps fix an image in the Anglophone world that she is not simply a teacher, but also a goddess of reason with a doomed fate, which sells books and pollinates 1,000 essays. The 20th and 21st centuries keep the momentum. She appears in art, in essays, and in movies. The 2009 film Agora, directed by Alejandro Amenabar and starring Rachel Weisz, stages her as both astronomer and the last defender of the library, a story arc de triomphe for the imagination and a collision with the historical timeline. The film conflates the destruction of the Serapeum in 391 with her murder in 415 and chooses drama over pedantry. It also gives her a near-modern sense of scientific method and heliocentrism to dramatize the tragedy of knowledge suppressed. The liberties help the film ask the kind of moral questions art loves. Real history, meanwhile, sits humming with its boxes of evidence and the patient work of reconciling sources that differ by centuries and agendas. Precisely because the filmed version leans into torchlight and betrayal, it creates a fresh pile of myths that need gentle dismantling. The first myth says she was the head librarian of Alexandria. The great library's head librarians belong to the Hellenistic era. Names like Zenodotus, Callimachus, Aristophanes of Byzantium, Aristarchus of Samothrace. That job title is not on her resume. The Mausian that once defined library culture had withered long before she lectured. Alexandria's scholarly life in 400 runs through private schools, church-run scriptoria, and what remains of civic institutions. She leads a Neoplatonist school. She shapes students, who then staff the empire's bureaucracy. She edits complex texts into better versions. That is influence wrapped in leather scroll casings, not librarian cosplay. The second myth grants her the role of first female mathematician, as if the ancient world issued only one ticket. The surviving record credits other women with mathematical and philosophical chops before and after her. Pythagorean tradition preserves the name of Theano and other woman philosophers in that school, though the legends around them are hazy. In late antiquity, thinkers like Sosipatra of Pergamum teach philosophy with brilliant reputations. Hypatia stands out not because she is an only, but because she crashes a specific party. She teaches publicly in a major city, engages with elite governance, and is named in sources that survive. Her fame reflects access to a loud stage as much as absolute uniqueness. The third myth logs her into an anti-Christian role that erases her network. Her best documented student becomes a bishop. She advises officials appointed by a Christian emperor. Her life shows the entanglement of pagan and Christian intellectual traditions in a city where everyone borrows from everyone else, while arguing about superiority at high volume. She believes in the gods. Her students do not always. The charisma of her teaching and the utility of her mathematics cross religious borders with embarrassing ease. The fourth myth claims that her murder marks the sudden death of ancient science. The catastrophe reading of history flatters the tidy mind. It underestimates inertia. After 415, Alexandria continues to produce scholars. 5th and 6th century mathematicians like Eutocius, John Philoponus, and others keep writing. The intellectual center of gravity will shift over centuries to places like Athens, Gaza, and later to Syriac and Arabic-speaking institutions in places such as Nisibis, Jundishapa, Baghdad, and Cordoba. The story of science dodges single funerals. Her death is a shock and a symbol. It is not a sole cause of decline. The bits that are not myth are impressive enough, without embroidery. She stands as a public philosopher in her city's forum, speaks to power, and does the unglamorous work of keeping complicated texts alive. She stabilizes, upgrades, and deploys the intellectual software of the ancient world. And that software runs for centuries in monasteries, madrasas, and universities, and has influence at scale. She also gives modern audiences a snapshot of how gender performance and intellectual authority collide. The mantle she wears matters as much as the theorems. She expounds because both stake claims in public. People in Alexandria see a woman in a philosopher's uniform and react with a combination of admiration, fascination, and rage that looks familiar to anyone who has watched the internet react to a woman explaining physics. The city turns her into an avatar of argument about what kind of person gets to teach, advise, and take up space over cobblestones. When she dies, the ripple spread is measurable even in legal files. Imperial legislation in 416 clamps down on the Parabolani. The text preserved in the Theodosian Code restricts their numbers and emphasizes that their medical charity role does not translate into a license to meddle in politics. Constantine and his successors had issued a tradition of laws that recognized Christian institutions while still asserting imperial sovereignty. In Alexandria, this tradition meets a wall. Cyril keeps pushing. The emperor writes laws to shore up the wall. Life in the empire continues, now with additional built-in friction. Her father, Theon, disappears from the record around or before 405. The editorial work he does on Euclid's Elements is sticky beyond belief. Modern editions of Euclid still carry marks of Theon's standardized version. Some historians speculate that the version of the Elements that dominated from late antiquity through the Renaissance bears Hypatia's improvement fingerprints as well. Though direct attribution cannot be proven, it counts as a historically responsible thrill to imagine a father and daughter adjusting a diagram together with worn styluses, sniping at a messy line that must be drawn again. The social content of Hypatia's classroom still resonates. Neoplatonism in the early 5th century includes factions. Some, in the wake of Iamblichus, emphasize theurgy, ritual acts intended to unite the soul with the divine. Others stay more strictly in the realm of ethics and logic, looking to Plato and Aristotle, avoiding ritual. Contemporary scholarship often places Hypatia closer to the practical, mathematical, and philosophical mainstream, rather than to the more ritual-heavy wings. Her student Synesius writes hymns and discusses dreams that sound liturgical, but he also complains about the discomforts of life in office, the plague, and the difficulties of reconciling philosophy with episcopal duty. Hypatia's school seems to be the place where the messy blending of classical philosophy and Christian office gets hammered into an uneasy friendship. This is where the humor glitters around the edges of a painful story. Alexandria is not a place that believes in moderation. A riot can start in the theater, a march can start in a monastery, and a theological debate can start in a baker's line. The Parabolani, whose name possibly derives from paraballo, to risk, as in those who risk themselves in service to the sick, seem designed to satisfy two checkboxes at once: Christian charity and masculine performance. They carry the stretcher and the cudgel, often on the same day. The imperial edict that tells them to stay in their lane reads like the weary sigh of a government that would prefer its hospital aides not also moonlight as political muscle. If anyone is tempted to file this under quaint ancient things, a glance at any modern city where moral crusades show up to air-horn local governance out of the way serves as a useful translation. Students of narrative structure often love to point to irony as the engine of tragedy. Hypatia's story brings more irony per line than a playwright deserves. Alexandria celebrates a philosopher in public, then destroys her in public. The city sends her students into positions of power across the empire because she makes them capable. The same city becomes uninhabitable to her because power in Alexandria finds her inconvenient to its storyline. A figure defined by clarity of thought dies under the most chaotic circumstances her neighbors can devise. The scene sticks because the mind does not enjoy detecting order behind a pile of pottery shards. The recovery of her story is a story of its own. The primary sources that mention her include Socrates' Scholasticus's Ecclesiastical History, written in Greek between about 439 and 444, a church history that offers the most sober account of her death and the surrounding politics. Damasius's Life of Isidore, from the 6th century, survives in fragments via Photius's 9th century Bibliotheca and contributes dramatic detail and praise of her virtues. The Suda, compiled in the 10th century, offers a tidy entry that lists her works and repeats her fame. John of Nicu, a 7th century Coptic bishop writing in Gaz, portrays her as a pagan witch who deserves her fate, which tells the historian more about his world than about hers. A cluster of letters from Synesius of Cyrene in the early 400s gives texture to her relationships and the practical matter of teaching science. On the edges of the desert, the cross-checking of these sources produces a picture with fuzzy outlines and a sharp center. The center is a woman who ran a school and advised powerful men until a gang tore her apart and burned her. Her influence also operates in negative space, as the absence that shapes later discourse. Christian hagiography, after 415, grows more careful about the line between zealous crowd action and sanctioned holiness. Cyril's later triumph at Ephesus in 431 and his elevation as a defender of orthodoxy do not erase the sharp line that Socrates and other moderate church writers draw. Through 415, Enlightenment polemicists use her death as Exhibit A in their prosecution brief against fanaticism. Feminist histories of science in the 20th century revive her as a pioneer whose fame was stolen by violence and slow erasure. The recent push for more inclusive STEM representation uses her as a voice in the chorus that says, "Women have always been here, even when the obituary writers erase their names." She also offers a compact lesson in how intellectual work survives. Almost nothing of her direct writing remains. The world holds a handful of mentions, a few lines of acknowledgement, a cloud of references, and the echoes of a classroom through letters that survived mostly because their writer became a bishop. Yet scholars can still trace her through the fluid margins of ancient scholarship. Ancient math is Wikipedia if Wikipedia were copied by hand and stored in monasteries. An editor improves a diagram, and a later commentator quotes the improvement. A student writes home a brag that his teacher built an astrolabe with him, and a future reader concludes that the astrolabe lives and breathes in Alexandria because of that partnership. The web of inference, carefully woven, gives back a living portrait. She shows up in another place, where influence hides the bar for courage. Courage is overused in narratives like this, but the civic version matters. She does not teach in hiding. She does not reduce her risk profile by joining one faction hard enough that the other faction leaves her alone. She does not vanish into a private library when the city steams. She moves through the same streets every day, speaks in public rooms, and keeps sending copy requests to scribes. People can admire that without pretending it was prudent. The cost is visible in 415. The value shines as the years spool forward, and her name rises, again and again, as a symbol of what city life could be on its best days. The humor her story allows is rarely gentle, but it keeps the telling sane. Late antique Alexandria tosses events at the reader that demand a crooked smile. A city capable of simultaneously producing a table of planetary longitudes and a mob with broken tiles for knives looks like a paradox. It is not. It is a normal human city with libraries and tempers. The Parabolani's dual role as hospice workers and political enforcers would be rejected by any modern HR department with a pulse. The monks' campaign tactics make modern comment sections look undercaffeinated. The fact that laws were needed to keep them out of city council meetings reads like a municipal farce rendered in stone and Latin. The joke that history writes beneath all this is unfair and precise. Hypatia wins arguments for decades, then loses to a rumor. Numbers and diagrams do not shield their author from a crowd that has already decided on a verdict. The minute this truth lands, it becomes valuable for people who teach for a living. Influence counts on patient instruction and fragile civility. It dies when crowds choose spectacle over speech. The work of holding a city together matters as much as the work of holding a proof together, in a way that would probably make her sigh with recognition. Hypatia's greatest lesson is less about conics than about civic design. The cautionary flashes do not erase the many moments when her influence sets a new norm. A woman in the late Roman Empire emerges as the most famous mathematician in her city and commands the respect of governors and bishops. That alone twists the curve of expectation for any young reader. A scholar with tools on her bench solves her students' engineering problems, and not just their metaphysical ones. That tells any instructor that mixing theory with practice turns ears toward a voice. A teacher who keeps public space open for debate models a city's best hope in every century. That part of her life, the part in which she moves through crowded squares and micromanages a commentary so it fits inside a learner's head, is the durable influence. Her memory accumulates footnotes that matter. She likely dies in early March 415. Lent in Egypt in that year begins in late February or early March, depending on calendars. Peter the Lector, the named instigator, holds a minor clerical rank that reads like a one-line resume. Reader, assistant, zealot. Orestes' tenure as prefect runs from 412 to perhaps 415, and his disappearance from the record suggests an exit not long after. Cyril continues as bishop until his death in 444, long enough to shape theology across continents. The Theodosian Code entry 16242 in 416, and related rescripts try, with varying success, to neuter the Parabolani's political role. These data points anchor the story, so that no romantic overlay can float it too far from shore. The irony that ripples through the Suda's entry on Hypatia is impossible to ignore. The compiler lists her achievements, praises her eloquence, admits her exceptional standing, and then closes with her violent end. A reference book that lists heads of state, philosophical terms, and obscure Greek vocabulary stops and acknowledges a woman whose final scene is so vivid that even dry prosopography cannot look away. The Suda's compilers knew drama when it hit them in the face. They also knew what counts as enduring fame in a culture that believes commentary can be immortality. She has it. A quieter legacy emerges in the technical traditions that survive her. Medieval Arabic scholars will work with the Greek heritage of mathematics in translation and commentary, and then their work will loop back into Latin Europe in the 12th century Renaissance of translation. Traveling through that long arc requires that the Greek texts stay clean enough to copy. Hypatia and her father stand in that slender corridor through which clean text passed. This is not a romantic role. It is error correction. It is dull until it is not. Students who have stared at a corrupted line of code understand why gratitude to anonymous editors should be a civic virtue. Hypatia is not anonymous. She feels like a gift left in the drawer by an ancestor who knew exactly when the flashlight batteries would fail. Her status as a figure in the history of feminism deserves the same mixture of pride and footnotes. She lived in a world where legal rights for women were real, but limited in upper-class urban contexts. Roman law allowed elite women property rights and public presence. Greco-Roman philosophical circles had long included women in various capacities, though not with equal numbers. Hypatia presses the existing edges to their limit and decorates them with her name. She does it not through a printed manifesto, but through daily practice and the stubborn insistence that her voice belongs. No one needs to pretend. She started a named movement to celebrate the fact that her career shifts the Overton window of her time, which is exactly the kind of phrase a modern audience can enjoy, tucked next to a papyrus roll. Her intellectual lineage says something about generational strategy. Theon invests in his daughter and includes her in serious work. He does not keep her as a branding tool to persuade more male students to pay tuition. He writes her into a preface because she earns a line. This is mentorship that does not fuss about optics. It pays subtle dividends as her students grow into their own careers and carry her respect forward as the expectation they apply to future teachers. Anyone who has ever read a good graduate student acknowledgement page and smiled in recognition understands that Hypatia's school is where academic love languages were already fluent in the 5th century, and she gives the ancient world one of its cleanest mic drops, even if it is told by others. The sanitary cloth anecdote does not read like flirtation. It reads like a philosopher doing brand management with surgical precision. She pushes back on the cult of romantic love, not because she despises affection, but because she believes that her mission as a teacher requires attention beyond what any marriage market can offer. A modern audience can laugh because the gesture is savage. The laughter holds a truth about focus, boundaries, and the right to set one's role inside a noisy culture. She would probably roll her eyes at the hashtags, then write a commentary that actually helps people do the math homework. What the city took from her, the centuries keep returning in tribute. Voltaire's entry, Gibbon's glowing paragraphs. Kingsley's novel, however compromised. Scholarly monographs tracing the textual tradition of Diophantus and finding her faint fingerprints. The fact that modern astronomers still teach with planispheric astrolabes as historical learning tools and mention her to students. The detail that a 9th century scholar still cites a 6th century commentator who mentions a 5th century teacher, carrying the echo forward. The small gravitational pull of her name in every conversation about women, in STEM, in antiquity. Influence functions like that. It is not a line. It is an orbit. The city that killed her cannot quite silence the story any more than it could prevent sailors from using tables, edited by her family, to navigate the seas that brought grain to Constantinople. This is the final irony, tucked like a dagger in the folds of a philosopher's cloak. Civic cruelty and intellectual progress can happen on the same street at the same hour. The same crowd that howls for a rumor can feed its children with bread, whose arrival depends on calculations maintained by the house of the person they just condemned. The universe has never promised moral coherence. Hypatia's life shows how to build coherence of a better kind. Careful calculation, long patience, and the repeated refusal to confuse noise with truth. When a modern museum labels a display case astrolablate antique design, a quiet link arcs back to her classroom. A student, then a bishop, then a copyist, then a 10th century compiler, all carried a piece of her work forward. She occupies the historical timeline as an energy source people continue to plug into. There is no need to make up speeches or put modern slogans in her mouth. Her students' letters and her enemies' accusations do enough. They tell the story of a woman who made Alexandria's streets smarter and who died on them because her city could not tolerate her as it was and could not deny her as she stood. And that is the dangerous edge of every city that ever lived. The best days of a place require its boldest teachers. The worst days of a place aim for them first. Hypatia of Alexandria rides in her carriage each morning through that exact line, turns public space into a seminar room, and hands out the tools for computing a safer orbit. She dies within walking distance of a set of tables that can tell a ship captain where the moon will be at midnight. She lives forever in the way a masterclass lives, when the transcript goes viral across centuries, not because the author scripted it for reach, but because her city, even in rage, could not avoid making her memorable. The record closes its last page with a final inventory that sounds like a brass plaque. Georgian scholars will still cite her. Byzantine compilers will still list her. Historians of mathematics will still diagram her influence, using arrows that cross centuries. Cynics will still complain that the ending ruins the plot. Philosophers will still whisper that the ending makes the plot. Teachers will still show up to class in cities that know both bread rights and research grants. Students will still build astrolabes and complain about conics, and then grow up to write letters about hydrometers to the people who taught them. Her story does not require a cure for mortality to sound like immortality. It requires the gritty honor of understanding that influence is measured not only in surviving books, but in the way a life writes itself into the behavior of others. She remains the city's most famous teacher. She remains its last scholar, in the sense that memory crowned her as the final emblem of a classical tradition in a city barreling into a different age. She remains the quiet apology that Alexandria offers to the idea of reason each time it tells her story honestly, names the perpetrators, names the bishop and the prefect, cites the sources, and refuses to bathe the pottery shards in the perfume of myth. The applause that modern audiences give her is deserved and late. The work that produced it is patient and old. That work looks like a set of commentaries, a circle of students, a willingness to be visible where visibility was a risk, and the solid grace to make hard math simpler so that strangers would understand. She deserves the last word, even if the last word is simply this: a life spent making difficult things clear is a life with a long half-life. Centuries decay around it. The light lingers,